settle in, and welcome to HistSleep. Today, we gently step into the story of medieval ideas that were never meant to last, yet quietly shaped the world we still live in. Most people think history is shaped by great ideas, carefully planned decisions, visionary leaders looking centuries into the future. But the truth is much quieter than that. Much of the world we live in today exists not because someone planned it, but because someone never came back to undo it. In the medieval world, life was unstable, dangerous, and deeply uncertain. People solved problems quickly, often clumsily, and always with the assumption that the solution was temporary, just something to get through the week, or the season, or the crisis. But centuries passed. The crisis ended. The people disappeared. And the temporary solution stayed. Today, we still follow rules, habits, and systems that were never meant to survive beyond a single moment of medieval panic. They weren't designed to last. They simply did that. This is the calm, forgotten story of medieval things that were supposed to be temporary but never went away. The accidental legacy. The medieval world was a masterclass in improvisation. It was not an age guided by long-term vision, strategic planning, or carefully drafted blueprints for the future. It was an age ruled by immediacy. Survival came first. Comfort came second. Permanence was rarely considered at all. People did not ask whether a solution would still make sense in 100 years, because most did not expect their own lives to be predictable beyond the next season. In a world shaped by disease, hunger, war, and weather, the idea of permanence felt almost arrogant. Daily medieval life unfolded in fragments. Crops could fail without warning. Roads dissolved into mud after a single storm. Towns burned, rebuilt, and burned again. Authority was inconsistent. Communication was slow, and knowledge traveled unevenly. When problems arose, and they arose, constantly there was little time or energy for perfection. What mattered was speed. What mattered was whether something worked well enough, and if it did, it stayed, not by intention, but by neglect. Half of medieval life was created in moments of urgency. The other half survived because no one remembered why it had begun in the first place. A rule might be written during a crisis, enforced with great seriousness for a short time, and then quietly absorbed into routine long after the emergency faded. Over years, and then generations, the reason for the rule dissolved, but the rule itself remained. It became part of the landscape unchallenged, unquestioned, and eventually invisible. Medieval societies were not designed to revisit decisions. There was no systematic review of laws, customs, or habits. Kings came and went, but systems outlived them. Town councils changed members, but inherited the same regulations. The church preserved traditions with almost sacred rigidity. If something existed, it was assumed to have a reason even if that reason had been forgotten centuries earlier. The absence of explanation did not weaken authority. In many cases, it strengthened it. This created a world where improvisation hardened into tradition with surprising speed. A temporary workaround could become accepted practice within a single generation. Children grew up assuming that what they inherited had always existed. By the time they became adults, the origin of these customs felt too distant to question. Memory shortened. Habit lengthened, and slowly, the temporary became permanent. The medieval mind understood time differently from our own. History was not viewed as steady progress toward improvement, but as repetition. Seasons returned. Famine followed abundance, peace dissolved into war and back again. The past felt close, not distant. Grandparents lived under many of the same rules as their grandchildren. This closeness made it easy for short-term measures to blend seamlessly into the rhythm of life. A solution introduced for now quietly became the way things are done. Improvisation was visible everywhere. Towns expanded without planning, bending around rivers, hills, and existing structures. Streets twisted because they followed old footpaths rather than design. Buildings leaned, merged, and overlapped, growing outward as families expanded. What looks chaotic to modern eyes was simply practicality layered over time. No one stopped to reset the system, they only added to it. Social structures followed the same pattern. Occupations passed down through families, not always because of passion or skill, but because systems formed quickly and then froze. A son became what his father was because the path already existed. Guilds created rules to solve immediate conflicts, and those rules endured long after the conflicts were forgotten. What began as protection became restriction. What began as order became limitation. Fear also played a powerful role in preserving temporary fixes. Change carried risk. Altering a rule might upset the balance of power. Removing a custom might provoke unrest. In fragile societies, stability mattered more than logic. It was safer to tolerate inefficiency than to invite chaos. And so, even when people sensed that a system no longer made sense, they often chose endurance over reform. Authority reinforced this inertia. New rulers inherited old structures and relied on them, regardless of their origins. To dismantle our system required explanation, enforcement, and effort. To keep it required nothing at all. Silence became consent. Time became legitimacy. The longer something existed, the more natural it appeared. Over decades, and then centuries, these accidental decisions layered themselves into the foundations of everyday life. One emergency solution rested atop another, one forgotten justification buried beneath routine. The medieval world slowly transformed improvisation into inheritance. People lived inside systems they did not design, obeyed rules they did not understand, and passed them on without question. This is the quiet paradox of the Middle Ages, an era often dismissed as chaotic, unplanned, and crude, left behind structures of remarkable durability, not because medieval people aimed for permanence, but because they rarely returned to undo what had already been done. Their world did not deliberately build the future, it stumbled into it. And once a temporary solution survives long enough, it stops feeling temporary at all. The temporary fix in history. Nothing is more permanent than a temporary solution that actually works. This is not a saying born from philosophy or hindsight. It is a pattern repeated so often that it quietly governs how civilizations evolve, especially in the medieval world, where stability was rare and urgency was constant. Temporary fixes were not exceptions. They were the default response to almost every problem. And when one of these fixes solved an issue just well enough, it gained something far more powerful than intention. Momentum. Medieval societies did not have the luxury of careful planning. Communication was slow, resources were limited, and authority was fragmented. When something broke, whether it was a road, a system of trade, or public order, there was no committee to debate ideal solutions. Instead, Someone acted. A rule was declared. A structure was adjusted. A workaround was put in place. The expectation was simple. This would last until a better option appeared. But in most cases, a better option never came. What mattered was functionality. If a solution reduced chaos, even slightly, it was preserved. If it brought order, even imperfectly, it was protected, and over time usefulness became justification. The original problem faded from memory, but the solution remained, now defended not as a response to crisis, but as tradition. What had once been temporary stopped being seen as temporary at all. Many things we consider modern habits today trace their roots back to these medieval panic moves. The way news was shared, the way towns were organized, the way people were taxed, identified, or controlled, all of these systems began as quick answers to immediate problems. They were never meant to scale. They were never meant to endure. They were simply meant to work. Take communication, for example. In a largely illiterate society, written notices were ineffective. Reading required education, time, and access to materials most people did not have. When information needed to spread quickly about danger, law, or public order, it had to be spoken aloud. This led to loud, centralized methods of communication that prioritized reach over nuance. The solution was temporary, born out of necessity. Yet the logic behind its central voices, distributing information to passive listeners, never truly disappeared. The same pattern applied to physical space. Medieval towns did not grow according to design, but reaction. When populations increased, buildings were added wherever there was room. When trade expanded, markets spilled into streets. When defense became necessary, walls were built quickly, often enclosing existing chaos rather than organizing it. These arrangements were meant to solve immediate pressures, but once built, they shaped daily life for generations. Roads followed old paths. Property lines hardened. Temporary layouts became permanent geography. Even governance followed this logic. Rules were created to manage specific situations. Shortages, conflicts, moral panics, or religious concerns. A law might exist to control prices during a famine, to limit movement during unrest, or to regulate behavior during holy days. These laws were rarely repealed once the situation improved. Removing a rule required effort, authority, and justification. Keeping it required nothing. And so, rules accumulated. Not because they were still necessary, but because they were already there. There was also a psychological comfort in temporary fixes that worked. They reduced fear. They created predictability in an unpredictable world. People adjusted their expectations around them. Over time, these fixes became woven into daily routine. Once something becomes routine, questioning it feels disruptive, even dangerous. This is how short-term solutions quietly transform into long-term structures. Medieval life reinforced this process through repetition. Generations lived under the same systems without witnessing their origins. Children inherited customs without context. To them, these practices did not feel temporary or improvised. They felt ancient, inevitable, and unchangeable. The fact that something had existed as long as anyone could remember was often enough to give it authority. Another reason temporary solutions endured was the absence of clear endpoints. Crises in the medieval world rarely ended cleanly. Wars faded into uneasy peace. Diseases receded but returned. Economic hardship eased but never vanished. When a problem never fully disappears, the solution designed to address it also never feels obsolete. The temporary stay becomes permanent, simply because the emergency never feels. Entirely overpowered structures benefited from this ambiguity. Authorities discovered that temporary measures could quietly expand control. Taxes introduced for short-term needs created ongoing revenue. Surveillance measures justified by safety became tools of governance. Identification systems designed for administration turned into mechanisms of classification. None of this required malicious intent. It emerged naturally from systems that were never rolled back. Importantly, medieval people were not foolish for accepting this. They were pragmatic. Challenging a working system required energy, risk, and coordination resources that were often scarce. For most, survival depended on adaptation, not reform. It was easier to live within an imperfect system than to imagine dismantling it. Over time, acceptance turned into normalization. This normalization is what allowed temporary fixes to survive technological change, political upheaval, and social transformation. Even as the medieval world slowly gave way to early modern society, many of its emergency solutions remained intact, simply rebranded or slightly adjusted. Their origins faded, but their functions endured. The irony is that these systems often outlive the problems they were meant to solve. What began as a response to scarcity persisted into abundance. What was created to control chaos remained long after chaos had changed form. The temporary fix became a structural feature of daily life, not because it was ideal, but because it was familiar. And familiarity in history is one of the strongest forces of all. The birth of the town crier. Take the town crier, for instance. Despite how official the role later became, it was never meant to exist at all. It was not a career, not a title, and certainly not a respected civic institution. It began as something far simpler and far more desperate. A single voice, raised in panic, trying to outrun disaster. In medieval towns, emergencies were not rare interruptions. They were part of daily life. Fire spread quickly through wooden buildings, packed tightly together. Wells could be poisoned or polluted without warning. Livestock wandered off. Violence broke out suddenly, and when danger appeared, there was no siren, no radio, no printed notice that could reach everyone in time. The only option was sound. Someone had to shout. At first, this was informal. Whoever noticed the danger first ran through the streets, yelling whatever warning they could. The mill is on fire. The river is flooding. Stop dumping waste into the well. These were not announcements crafted with care. They were raw, urgent messages shaped by fear and breathlessness. The goal was not clarity or elegance. It was speed. This method was assumed to be temporary by nature. Once the fire was out, the shouting stopped. Once the danger passed, silence returned. No one imagined that warning people aloud would become a standing responsibility. It was simply what you did when something went wrong. But medieval towns noticed something important. People listened. In a world where most people could not read, sound carried authority. A loud voice moved faster than written words ever could. It traveled down narrow streets, echoed off stone walls, and cut through the noise of daily labor. When someone shouted with urgency, people stopped what they were doing. They paid attention. And slowly, communities began to rely on this reaction. Over time, towns started to assign the task deliberately. Instead of waiting for panic to choose a messenger, officials selected someone known for a strong voice and physical endurance. This person would be responsible for spreading urgent messages when needed. It was still considered temporary, a practical arrangement to handle recurring emergencies. To make sure the voice was heard, a bell was added. The bell was not symbolic at first. It was functional. Its sharp sound cleared attention before the words were spoken. Ring first, then shout. This simple sequence became remarkably effective. What began as an emergency tactic slowly shifted into something more organized. If a person was already walking the streets to announce danger, why not use them to announce other things as well? Lost animals, market days, new rules, public punishments. The logic was straightforward. The system worked, so it was used again. At no point did anyone stop to declare, "We are creating a new profession." The transition happened quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. The man who once shouted only during crises was now speaking regularly. His presence became expected. His voice became familiar. Eventually, the town crier was no longer associated only with emergencies. He became the town's voice. Laws were announced through him. Royal decrees were made official when spoken aloud in public spaces. In many places, hearing the crier's words counted as legal notification. Whether you liked it or not, you were considered informed. This shift had deep consequences. Spoken announcements replaced written ones as the primary method of public communication. Authority became auditory. The voice of the crier was not just informative, it was performative. The act of speaking made the message real. Still, the role was never planned with longevity in mind. It was built on convenience. And convenience, once established, is difficult to undo. Towns adjusted their routines around the crier's schedule. People learned when to listen. Silence at certain hours became meaningful, just as sound had been. Over generations, the temporary solution hardened. The town crier gained official recognition. Uniforms were introduced not to honor the role, but to ensure credibility. A recognizable appearance meant the message could be trusted. Pay was assigned not as a reward, but as a necessity. The crier needed to survive to keep shouting. What is striking is how little resistance this change encountered. No one protested the rise of the town crier because it solved a real problem. It reduced confusion. It centralized information. And in a fragmented world, centralized information felt like order. The original purpose, the emergency, faded from memory. Few remembered a time before the crier existed. Children grew up assuming this was simply how towns worked. News arrived by voice. Authority arrived by bell. The improvisation of one moment became the structure of everyday life. There was also no clear moment when the role could be retired. Emergencies never fully disappeared. Fire, disease, crime, these threats remained constant. As long as danger existed, the logic behind the crier's role stayed intact. And as long as he was already there, it made sense to keep using him. This is how temporary solutions gain endurance. They attach themselves to ongoing problems. They adapt just enough to remain useful. And in doing so, they shed their temporary identity. The town crier did not survive because medieval people valued tradition for tradition's sake. He survived because removing him required imagining an alternative. And imagining alternatives required literacy, infrastructure, and systems that did not yet exist. So the voice remained, long after the panic faded, long after the first shout echoed through the streets. long after anyone remembered why shouting had begun in the first place. Efficiency over literacy. But then, towns realized something that quietly reshaped medieval life. People actually listened to a loud man with a bell, not out of curiosity, not out of respect for learning, but out of necessity. Sound demanded attention in ways that written words could not. In a world built from stone, wood, and narrow streets, noise traveled fast. A bell cut through conversation, labor, prayer, and argument alike. It did not ask for permission, it simply arrived. This realization did not come from theory or philosophy. It came from observation. When a bell rang, people stopped. When a voice followed, people listened. When parchment was nailed to a wall, most people walked past it without noticing. Literacy was rare, uneven, and often irrelevant to daily survival. But hearing was universal. Everyone could listen, and listening required no preparation. Medieval towns were pragmatic places. They valued what worked immediately over what might work someday. Teaching people to read required time, money, teachers, and stability, things most towns lacked. Education was slow. Its rewards were distant and uncertain. A literate population might be beneficial in the future, but a loud announcement solved problems now. So towns made an unspoken calculation. Why build schools when you could hire one man? Why invest in books when you could invest in lungs? Why teach hundreds of people to read laws when you could simply shout the law into the street and consider the job done? This was not framed as ignorance. It was framed as efficiency. Efficiency mattered more than understanding. Speed mattered more than depth. Clarity mattered more than nuance. In a medieval town, a message that arrived late was often useless. A warning that required reading might be missed entirely. A spoken announcement, by contrast, arrived instantly and demanded response. The town crier became the perfect solution to this reality. He turned information into sound. He removed the barrier of literacy entirely. News no longer depended on who could read, but on who could hear, and almost everyone could hear. Over time, this changed how information itself was valued. Knowledge became something distributed from above rather than discovered individually. People waited for announcements. They listened for permission, instruction, and warning. The habit of receiving information passively replaced the habit of seeking it actively. Written notices still existed, but they were secondary. Often, they served more as symbols than tools, physical proof that authority had spoken. Many notices were read aloud by someone else anyway. The written word still required a voice to become meaningful. This reinforced a powerful hierarchy. Those who controlled the voice controlled the narrative. The town crier did not simply repeat information. He embodied it. His presence turned a message into an event. His bell marked the beginning of official truth. And importantly, not everything was announced. What went unsaid mattered as much as what was spoken. Silence became a form of control. If something was not rung into the street, many people would never know it existed. This made information selective by default, shaped by priorities of those in power rather than curiosity of the public. Medieval authorities found this system comfortable. It reduced unpredictability. It created a shared rhythm of listening and responding. Morning announcements, market proclamations, legal declarations, life moved in sync with sound. Literacy, by contrast, introduced unpredictability. A literate A literate person could read privately. They could interpret independently. They could question meaning. They could discover contradictions. For a society built on fragile order, this independence was inefficient and potentially destabilizing. So, literacy was allowed, but contained. It was encouraged for clergy, scribes, merchants, and administrators, people whose roles required interaction with text. For everyone else, listening was enough. Understanding was optional. Compliance was sufficient. This was never presented as a denial of education. It was presented as common sense. People needed bread, not books. Protection, not philosophy. Information, delivered quickly and clearly, served the collective better than education delivered, slowly and unevenly. The result was a culture shaped around sound. Bells marked time. Bells marked authority. Bells marked danger. The town became an auditory space, organized not by text but by rhythm. When to work, when to gather, when to obey. Children grew up learning to listen rather than read. They learned which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. The bell became a signal of seriousness. A voice without a bell was just noise. A voice with a bell carried weight. This created a subtle but lasting psychological pattern. Knowledge was something external. It arrived unexpectedly. It required immediate reaction, not reflection. You did not study a message. You responded to it. Even disagreement adapted to this structure. Rumors spread orally. Gossip traveled faster than writing ever could. Truth and falsehood competed in the same auditory space. But official announcements always had the advantage of volume, ritual, and repetition. Over generations, this normalized the idea that efficiency was more valuable than comprehension. A rule did not need to be explained in detail if it could be announced loudly. A law did not need justification if it could be repeated often enough. This habit survived long after the medieval world itself began to change, even as printing slowly spread. Oral announcements remained central. Printed notices supported spoken ones. They rarely replaced them. The instinct to listen was deeply ingrained. The medieval choice to prioritize efficiency over literacy was never intended to define society. It was a response to limitation, a shortcut taken in a world with little margin for error. It solved a real problem, and so it endured. And once a system organizes daily life effectively, removing it feels unnecessary, dangerous. So the bell continued to ring. The voice continued to speak, and listening continued to feel easier than learning. The permanent newsfeed. Soon, the temporary messenger, the town crier, came far more than a single voice shouting during emergencies. What began as a practical, fleeting solution had quietly transformed into a permanent institution, woven into the very fabric of medieval life. The crier now had a uniform, a salary, and in some towns, even something resembling a dynasty. His position was no longer temporary or improvised. It had become official, recognized, and expected. The uniform itself was a symbol of authority. No longer was this a mere villager running through streets in whatever he happened to wear. Now, he donned a coat or tunic that distinguished him from ordinary townsfolk, sometimes adorned with the town's colors or heraldic symbols. The uniform sent a clear message. When this man speaks, the town listens. Appearance alone lent weight to words, turning speech into an event rather than a simple announcement. With formality came compensation. Payment was no longer an afterthought or a gift. It became a recognized wage. Towns understood that if a person was to rise before dawn, walk through crowded streets, and endure the elements, he deserved reward. This salary reinforced his authority. A paid voice was a sanctioned voice, and people came to trust it as a reliable conduit of truth. The crier's income made him accountable to the town, ensuring consistency and dedication, and it made the role attractive enough that skillful voices could pursue it professionally in some towns. The office of town crier passed from generation to generation. Fathers trained sons, and in certain areas, daughters learned as well. The role became hereditary, not by law, but by convenience. Families who had mastered the art of projecting their voice through narrow alleys, balancing on uneven cobblestones, and timing announcements to coincide with market schedules naturally retained the position. The dynasty ensured that experience and the rhythm of town life itself was preserved across decades. This long-term presence transformed the crier into a medieval version of a push notification, one that could not be ignored, swiped away, or muted. Unlike a written notice that could be lost, overlooked, or destroyed, the crier's message was unavoidable. His bell announced it, and his voice carried it through streets, courts, and squares. Whether one was tending livestock, working at a forge, or sleeping in an upper-floor room, one heard him. Compliance, knowledge, and awareness were all enforced audibly. The town crier also centralized communication in ways that writing could not. Whereas messages could previously scatter or be misinterpreted, the crier provided a singular source for official news. Conflicting versions of events became less common. People listened, and the act of listening itself became a shared experience. Communities were synchronized by the same sound, moving in time to the rhythm of announcements. The uniform, the bell, and the position's permanence reinforced the notion that this was the official voice of authority. This permanence also had social consequences. The crier's voice became part of daily life, setting schedules and expectations. Market days, court sessions, religious holidays, and public punishments were all signaled through him. Townspeople learned to orient themselves according to his presence, understanding that when he rang the bell or shouted, something mattered. He was both messenger and timekeeper, embedding authority directly into the auditory landscape with repeated exposure. The town crier shaped not just behavior, but perception. When a crier announced new regulations or tax collection, citizens accepted it as legitimate because the announcement was public, audible, and official. The sound itself carried weight beyond the content of the message. It is difficult to overstate how powerful this simple integration of sound, authority, and ritual became over time. It created an expectation that official messages would always arrive in this manner, reinforcing the crier's permanent role. Interestingly, this system reinforced itself as the town relied more heavily on the crier. It required the role to be more structured. Announcements became scheduled and regular. People anticipated them. They coordinated activities around them. The more towns depended on the crier, the more formal the position became, and the more impossible it was to remove. What started as a temporary solution had become an embedded institution, shaping the very way communities functioned. The crier's presence also affected the psychology of townspeople. They no longer needed to seek information actively. It came to them. Knowledge became a passive reception. People heard the news because it arrived, not because they chased it. This had profound consequences for medieval literacy, governance, and social order. A town crier could enforce rules, spread warnings, and even shape public opinion, all simply by existing in the right place at the right time. His authority was both immediate and cumulative. The permanence of the crier's role had ripple effects on literacy and education as well. Since the spoken word could reach everyone, there was less immediate need for reading skills among the general population. Notices, decrees, and even legal requirements could be conveyed orally. Schools were expensive and slow, whereas one competent crier could address the entire town in moments. These efficiencies reinforced the practicality of the role, ensuring that reliance on the crier persisted for generations. Furthermore, the crier helped unify diverse and sprawling medieval towns. In communities where multiple dialects were spoken or where new residents arrived frequently, the crier became a linguistic standard. His choice of words, pronunciation, and cadence shaped the way official speech was understood. The crier was not merely a messenger of content, but a standardizer of communication, a unifying voice in a world of fragmentation. The role also had legal implications. In many places, hearing the crier's announcement was considered sufficient to be informed of new laws or regulations. A citizen could not claim ignorance if the official voice had proclaimed the rule aloud. This gave the spoken word an authority equivalent to, or sometimes exceeding, written law. The permanence of the position was directly tied to the power of enforceable announcements. The more consistent the presence of the crier, the more enforceable the message became. Merchants, too, relied on the crier. Trade depended on coordination, rules, and timing. Announcements about market days, prices, or bans affected livelihoods. The crier's permanence meant that business could proceed with predictable order. Farmers, artisans, and traders all adjusted to the rhythms set by the bell and the voice. In this way, the town crier became an essential cog in the economic machinery of medieval life, not just a source of occasional news. Socially, the crier occupied a unique space. He was both servant and authority figure, messenger and enforcer, observer and participant. His position required independence, endurance, and stamina. A crier had to withstand weather, fatigue, and occasional hostility, yet remain neutral, reliable, and consistent. These qualities, once established in the role, became expectations for successors, cementing the office as permanent. Over time, the crier's influence extended beyond immediate announcements. Rituals and traditions developed around his presence. People woke at certain times expecting his voice. Festivals and religious events incorporated the sound of bells. Public punishments, ceremonies, and gatherings were all punctuated by his announcements. The crier's permanence shaped both civic and cultural rhythms. Even emergencies reinforced the role's authority. Fires, outbreaks of disease, or sudden military threats reminded townspeople of the necessity of a reliable messenger. Each crisis reinforced the expectation that a crier would be present, trained, and ready. Over decades, the position became institutionalized with formal procedures for hiring, training, and compensating the crier. Temporary had become permanent. The town crier was, in effect, the medieval version of a push notification, inescapable, authoritative, and unavoidable. Unlike digital alerts, which can be ignored, swiped away, or muted, the crier's presence enforced attention. Townspeople adjusted their lives around him. Work, worship, and daily routines all adhered, in part, to the rhythm of his bell. The position exemplified how a solution, initially designed for a single moment of crisis, could grow into a permanent, central feature of society. Ultimately, The crier's permanence was both practical and symbolic. He was proof that efficiency, visibility, and reliability could create structures that outlasted their original purpose. What started as a temporary emergency solution became a central institution, influencing governance, culture, economy, and social behavior. His bell was a reminder, repeated daily, that the temporary often becomes enduring simply by virtue of its necessity and effectiveness. The bell obsession. Then came the bells. In the Middle Ages, the solution to losing anything gore, keeping track of anything, was remarkably simple. Put a bell on it. At first, this seems almost absurd to modern sensibilities, yet in context, it was ingenious. In a world without watches, streetlights, or reliable communication networks, sound became a practical tool for order, awareness, and even survival. Bells were auditory signals, warning systems, identifiers, and markers of presence. They transformed space, society, and the rhythm of daily life, turning sound into structure. The earliest bells were functional. Livestock wandered freely through pastures, open fields, and even into towns. Farmers needed to know where their animals were without walking miles every hour. A bell attached to a cow, sheep, or goat provided immediate information. If a bell rang, the animal was nearby. If the sound stopped, the animal had worse. In a landscape riddled with fences that were often temporary and boundaries that were frequently ignored, bells served as both tracker and safeguard. From there, the logic extended quickly. If a bell could help locate a wandering animal, it could help locate valuable possessions. Keys, small tools, and even portable containers began to feature little jingles or tags. Merchants, artisans, and households adapted this simple auditory technology to prevent loss and facilitate movement. The practical impulse was clear. When sight and memory failed, sound could guide. And in a society where written records were cumbersome and literacy limited, auditory cues were immediate, universal, and persistent. Eventually, the obsession with bells extended beyond objects to people. Children were often outfitted with small bells to track them in crowded streets, market squares, or during festivals. Servants, particularly in large households, might carry a bell so that their presence could be monitored. Nobility, sometimes, adorned their horses, boots, or clothing with small bells, not just for ornamentation, but to signal approach, ensure coordination, or assert status. Bells became both practical tools and markers of social order. The proliferation of bells created a unique soundscape. Streets, town squares, and village paths were filled with jingling, ringing, and clanging. Bells marked labor, movement, and ownership. They indicated arrival and departure, alerting communities to activity that was otherwise invisible. Noise, in this context, was functional, almost informative. The medieval town, from dawn until dusk, became a space orchestrated by sound. This auditory landscape did more than track property. It enforced behavioral norms. The ringing of a bell signaled boundaries, order, and consequence. A lost or stolen item could be traced by its bell. A misbehaving child's jingling warned adults of proximity. The sound of approaching nobles' bells indicated authority and demanded deference. Bells became extensions of social hierarchy, carrying messages of wealth, control, and vigilance. Interestingly, this obsession also reflects the medieval mind's approach to problem solving: rapid, pragmatic, and heavily reliant on immediate sensory input. When faced with a problem, lost livestock, missing keys, wandering children's most actionable solution was to attach a bell. There was no need to invent complex mechanisms or systems. The bell solved multiple problems simultaneously. It located, it warned, and it communicated social status. Temporary fixes became enduring habits because they worked so well, so consistently, and so audibly. The social implications were profound. People became attuned to sound as a measure of presence and order. Townspeople learned to recognize specific jingles, sequences, and rhythms associated with different animals, servants, or objects. Bells created patterns of expectation. Silence was suspicious. Sound was informative. This auditory literacy became as important as reading or numeracy in understanding the environment. Over time, the use of bells expanded into ritual and ceremony. Church bells marked time for prayer. Civic bells announced market days, and celebratory bells punctuated weddings, festivals, or victories. The same technology that helped locate livestock now governed the rhythm of communal life. Bells linked private concerns, keeping track of property, people, and tools to public rituals, blending practicality with social cohesion. The ubiquity of bells also transformed urban planning and architecture. Towers were built not just as fortifications, but to amplify bell sound across towns. Market squares were designed to maximize auditory reach. Streets and paths, once irregular and organic, began to accommodate the transmission of sound. Bells, in effect, dictated human movement and perception. A town could be navigated as much by ear as by eye, creating a new kind of sensory map. This obsession with bells did not exist in isolation. It intersected with governance, commerce, and communication. Announcements by town criers were amplified by bells. Lost items could be traced. Alerts for fires or invasions were signaled through layers of jingles and rings. Bells became an infrastructure of safety, economy, and information flow up. Medieval technology of networked awareness. Merchants, too, benefited enormously. Goods, wagons, and carts often carried bells, alerting buyers, competitors, and officials. Movement, contracts, deliveries, and payments were synchronized with the ringing of bells. Farmers relied on auditory cues to coordinate with markets. The economy, like the social order, depended on sound as much as sight or text. Yet, the medieval bell obsession also had unintended consequences. Streets became noisy, particularly during festivals or busy market days. Sleep was interrupted, and the natural soundscape was dominated by human inventions. People grew accustomed to constant auditory input, learning to filter, prioritize, and respond selectively. In some ways, the bell reshaped attention itself, what could be ignored and what demanded action. Moreover, the aesthetic dimension evolved. Bells were no longer merely functional. They became decorative, signaling status and refinement. Nobles adorned clothing, boots, and horses with intricate, finely crafted bells. The jingling of a wealthy household announced prestige as much as presence. Utility merged with spectacle. Sound was both functional and symbolic. This obsession also illustrates a pattern seen repeatedly in medieval society. Temporary solutions evolve into permanent cultural habits. A bell attached to a cow to prevent it from getting lost leads to bells marking property, individuals, and status. A pragmatic tool becomes a cultural signature. What begins as emergency management or practical improvisation hardens into expectation, ritual, and even fashion. The sheer ubiquity of bells reinforced this permanence. Once towns adapted to sound as a signal, they could not easily unlearn it. Removing bells would be costly, confusing, and disruptive. Systems of sound had become infrastructure. Bells informed life, enforced norms, and guided behavior across generations. They were impossible to ignore, yet deeply integrated into daily rhythm. Interestingly, this auditory obsession influenced social behavior in subtle ways. People moved, spoke, and acted in response to sound. Timing became coordinated with bells. Children learned to associate ringing with responsibility and awareness. Merchants timed their trade, craftsmen their labor, and citizens their civic duties around auditory cues. Bells, initially tools for specific problems, structured entire temporal and social frameworks. In sum, the medieval bell obsession exemplifies how simple, practical solutions can transform into pervasive, enduring institutions. A device attached to an animal, a person, or a tool for immediate survival gradually shaped town planning, communication networks, social hierarchy, economic rhythms, and cultural rituals. What began as a pragmatic improvisation became, over decades, a defining feature of medieval life, a soundscape that regulated, informed, and ordered human existence. The bell obsession shows the enduring power of practicality. Temporary fixes do not always vanish when the crisis passes. They persist when they work, grow when they are effective, and become permanent when society adapts to them. In the Middle Ages, a simple piece of metal, shaped to make noise, carried consequences far beyond its size or intent, transforming the medieval town into a world orchestrated by sound. The medieval GPS. The idea was simple. Attach a bell to a sheep. In the fog, when the fields were shrouded in mist or morning dew, a shepherd could hear where his flock wandered. The sound carried, bouncing across hills, valleys, and hedgerows. He could track individual animals, detect strays, and ensure that none went missing. It was a temporary solution to a recurring problem, a practical tool for managing livestock in a world without sightlines or maps. And yet, as with many medieval fixes, its simplicity contained the seeds of something far greater. Humans, as history often shows, have a remarkable talent for overappreciating convenience and overcomplicating it. The shepherd's bell was functional, yes, but soon humans began to enjoy the effect of sound itself. There was a certain delight in jingling through a field, in announcing your presence without speaking. Sound became not only practical, but pleasurable, even fashionable. The technology that began as sheep management slowly migrated to human behavior, social signaling, and even status display. Nobles were among the first to adopt bells for themselves. If a bell worked for tracking sheep, why not use it for people? In grand halls, expansive castles, and Maeslic estates, it became useful and ostentatious too. Know exactly when someone entered a room. The faint jingle of boots or sleeves, once a tool of necessity, turned into an audible announcement of presence, wealth, and authority. In effect, nobles invented the medieval version of a personal GPS. The adoption of bells for humans was gradual, starting in elite households, but eventually spreading through courts, larger estates, and even some urban settings. Initially, it may have seemed absurd to spend money on tiny devices that produced noise merely to indicate someone's location. But the practice satisfied both practicality and pride. In a society where presence signaled power, being audibly noticed became a form of prestige. If your entrance could not be ignored, your authority was reinforced. Once nobles began to use bells in this way, it became a game of embellishment. Bells were attached to boots, sleeves, cloaks, belts, and even gloves. The richer the household, the more elaborate the jingle. Sometimes multiple bells were layered for volume. Sometimes they were decorated with gold or silver for style. Fashion and function merged seamlessly. Sound was no longer just informative, it was a statement. Entering a room announced status. An absence of bells implied something lesser, even invisible. This medieval obsession with audible presence had cascading social consequences. Servants and attendants followed suit, often carrying small bells to indicate readiness or availability. Guests adapted their behavior based on the jingling patterns of hosts. Courtiers learned to recognize the sound of important individuals and adjust their own actions accordingly. Sound became a subtle but powerful language of recognition, signaling social hierarchy and spatial awareness without uttering a single word. The effect on architecture was notable as well. Large halls, corridors, and chambers were designed with acoustics in mind. Sound needed to carry, to mark presence clearly across distances. The echo of a noble's boots could travel down stone staircases, signaling approach to multiple rooms simultaneously. In this sense, the auditory landscape became as important as the physical one, shaping human movement and behavior inside castles. Moreover, the practice reinforced accountability. Anyone attempting to sneak, hide, or escape notice had to contend with the jingling of their attire. In a court or manor, stealth was audibly impossible. Bells, initially a tool for livestock management, evolved into a regulatory device for human behavior. Nobles controlled not just what people saw or did, but what they heard. Sound enforced presence, visibility, and order. Interestingly, this also created a culture of auditory attention. People developed a sensitivity to tone, rhythm, and pattern. They learned to distinguish the bells of individuals, the cadence of footsteps, and the tempo of movement. Listening became a skill, as valuable as vision or memory, in public and private spaces alike. The human ear became a key instrument for navigating social and spatial structures. This medieval GPS effect extended beyond individual households. Bells were increasingly incorporated into public spaces. Courtyards, bridges, and streets began to feature bells that marked passage, danger, or boundaries. The line between practical signaling and social performance blurred. Citizens became accustomed to auditory cues, whether tracking people, goods, or animals. Sound organized movement in ways that sight alone could not. Over time, the bells' function multiplied. They tracked presence, signaled status, indicated authority, and enforced norms. They became markers of privilege, participation, and position within society. The more effective and recognizable a bell, the more it signaled credibility and prominence. This reinforced social hierarchies and created expectations. Those without bells were less important, less visible, less acknowledged. Cultural norms evolved around this auditory system. Etiquette included the recognition of jingles. Interruptions required knowledge of timing and presence. Even casual visitors or tradespeople learned to interpret the sounds, understanding when to bow, when to step aside, and when to wait. Bells encoded behavior and attention, embedding social codes directly into sound. Merchants also adopted similar practices. Bells attached to carts, wagons, and horses provided an early warning system for traffic and commerce. They allowed coordination of movement through busy streets, signaling arrival, departure, or low status. Bells became central to urban logistics, transforming them into tools for spatial awareness, commerce, and governance. As the practice spread, it entered the symbolic domain. Bells signified not just function, but identity. Wealth, taste, and sophistication could be demonstrated through auditory design. A well-placed jingle communicated refinement. Bells became a medium for expression, merging practicality with personality and social signaling. What began as a shepherd's tool had evolved into a marker of culture. The widespread adoption also shows a pattern common in medieval problem-solving. Temporary solutions expanded beyond their original intent. A bell meant for tracking livestock became a fashion statement. A tool designed for practicality became a marker of authority, social order, and cultural capital. The process was neither deliberate nor conscious. It emerged naturally as society adopted what was effective, enjoyable, or convenient. Furthermore, bells altered perception of space itself. Castles, halls, and streets were navigated by sound as much as sight. Residents learned to measure distance, anticipate arrival, and detect movement based on auditory cues. The medieval town and manor were effectively layered with invisible maps, encoded through jingles and chimes. People's awareness of their environment became attuned to these sounds, and the practice influenced behavior in profound ways. Ultimately, this medieval GPS phenomenon illustrates how temporary solutions can reshape social structures. What began as a means of tracking sheep became a pervasive system influencing fashion, authority, etiquette, architecture, and communication. Bells dictated where people could be, how they moved, and what they perceived. Temporary fixes, when effective and enjoyable, had the power to become permanent, defining everyday life in ways their creators could never have imagined. Noise pollution as fashion. What began as a practical tool for tracking animals, belongings, and even people soon evolved into something far more complex. A fashion statement. Bells, originally meant to solve immediate logistical problems, became a marker of status, taste, and identity. By the time anyone thought to reconsider, the streets, halls, and courtyards of medieval towns were alive with constant jingling, clanging, and ringing, a cacophony that marked presence, wealth, and style. Simultaneously, the night air, once silent except for natural sounds, had become a relentless symphony, so pervasive that uninterrupted sleep was a rare luxury. In the early days, the use of bells was primarily functional. Shepherds attached them to livestock to locate strays. Artisans attached them to important tools. Town criers relied on them to amplify their messages. But humans, as they often do, found ways to derive additional meaning from practicality. Bells became decorative, elaborate, and increasingly personalized. Nobles adorned clothing, boots, and gloves with jingles. Merchants added small, intricate bells to carts and merchandise. Bells began to communicate not just location, but identity. The sound itself became a signature, unique to each individual or household. The medieval obsession with bells as fashion accelerated quickly. The jingling of bells was no longer just about being heard, it was about being noticed, recognized, and envied. Wealthy individuals competed to have the most melodious, intricate, or numerous bells. Some bells were handcrafted from precious metals, etched with symbols, or polished to produce a specific timbre. Bells, once humble tools of utility, became markers of social hierarchy. Sound now communicated as much about status as about spatial awareness. This transformation blurred the line between necessity and performance. People learned to coordinate the rhythm of their jingles, creating a deliberate soundscape around their movements. Walks through streets or halls were choreographed to produce a pleasing, attention-commanding melody. Bells were carefully placed to amplify the effect. On the hem of a cloak, the tips of gloves, or the edges of boots, fashionable sound became an extension of visual identity, a performance that could not be ignored. The impact on urban life was profound. Streets filled with constant auditory signals, each layer of jingling conveying messages about wealth, presence, and movement. Market squares became arenas of sound, where merchants and nobles both announced and demonstrated their status through the clever arrangement of bells. Neighborhoods developed their own distinct auditory signatures. Visitors quickly learned to read the jingles, discerning who lived where, who was arriving, and who could be approached. Noise, initially accidental, became information. Nighttime was particularly affected. In towns where residents adorned themselves with multiple bells, the sounds did not cease after dusk. Nobles returning from evening gatherings, guards patrolling streets, and even servants moving about for domestic duties ensured that the jingling continued into the night. Unlike natural nocturnal sounds, wind, rain, or animals, the bells were persistent, human-made, and almost ritualistic. Sleep became a contested luxury. The urban auditory environment dictated wakefulness as much as darkness or daylight. The transformation of bells into fashion also had psychological effects. People became hyper-aware of their auditory listening was no longer a passive activity. It became a form of social literacy, recognizing the jingles of neighbors, rivals, and guests allowed individuals to interpret hierarchies, intentions, and movements without direct interaction. The ability to parse and respond to sound became as critical as vision or reading, shaping cognition and social behavior in a fundamental way. Merchants and artisans, for instance, developed specialized bells to signal arrival or announce products. Bells with specific pitches or sequences indicated the availability of luxury goods, while simpler bells marked everyday items. Townspeople quickly adapted, understanding and responding to these coded sounds. Sound became an additional layer of commerce, a medium through which both status and market intelligence were transmitted. The interplay of bells and fashion also introduced competitive spectacle. Nobles, merchants, and even wealthy craftsmen began to coordinate bells for events, festivals, and ceremonies. Elaborate arrangements of jingles became part of parades, courtly displays, and religious observances. Sound became an ornament, a statement, and sometimes even a weapon of attention. The louder, more melodious, or more numerous the bells, the greater the social impact. Interestingly, this auditory obsession also reinforced hierarchy in subtle ways. The poor, or less influential, could not compete with the soundscape of the elite. Without access to bells crafted from quality metals or designed with particular attention to tone, individuals were audibly invisible. Social stratification was encoded not just in dress, residence, or language, but in the very soundscape of a community. Noise became both privilege and performance, a medium of inclusion and exclusion. Even the design of architecture adapted. Buildings, hallways, and courtyards were constructed with acoustics in mind, allowing bells to project and resonate effectively. Towers and elevated platforms amplified sound for public announcements, ceremonies, or processions. Streets were arranged to carry jingles to the maximum number of listeners. Medieval towns became orchestrated environments where auditory presence was carefully considered alongside physical space. Over time, the sheer density of bells created unintended consequences. At market hours, the streets were sleep in dense. Urban centers became inconsistent and fragmented. Guards, servants, livestock, and nobles all contributed to the complex soundscape, and townspeople had to develop strategies for filtering and prioritizing auditory input. Human attention adapted, but at the cost of serenity. Silence became a rarity. Auditory stimulation was constant. This immersion in sound-shaped culture and daily life, people became attuned to timing and rhythm, anticipating events by the layers of jingling that preceded them. Morning bells signaled the start of labor. Midday bells indicated meal times or market activity. Evening bells marked curfew, closures, or the return of nobility. The town's collective consciousness was synchronized through a continuous, overlapping network of jingles, each layer carrying functional, social, and symbolic meaning. Moreover, the fashion of sound created feedback loops. The more bells a person wore, the more attention they received, which incentivized others to add bells or enhance their own. Noise generated social prestige, and prestige generated noise. Over decades, this reinforced the auditory environment, making the jingling permanent, immersive, and inescapable. Temporary fixes had become entrenched lifestyle choices. In essence, bells became a multidimensional phenomenon. Tools for tracking, instruments of communication, symbols of status, elements of fashion, and agents of urban organization. A practice that began as a simple solution to a practical problem had grown to dominate the sonic and social architecture of medieval towns. The jingles were unavoidable, pervasive, and deeply ingrained in daily routines. By the time the idea of stopping was considered, it was too late. The night air, once quiet, had become a tapestry of sound. Sleep, reflection, and calm were luxuries, rare enough to be remarkable. What started as a shepherd's tool now orchestrated entire communities. Fashion, functionality, and social hierarchy merged into a continuous auditory performance. The bell had transcended practicality, becoming the unmistakable pulse of medieval life. The accidental moat. Ever wonder about castle moats? The towering stone walls, the deep water-filled trenches, the sense of impenetrability. They appear as if carefully designed from the very beginning to intimidate and defend. But, as is often the case in medieval history, the reality is far more improvisational. Most moats did not start as grand defense plans or architectural statements of power. They began as temporary drainage ditches, practical solutions to immediate and very mundane problems, keeping the castle from sinking into mud, managing runoff during rains, and preventing the foundation from being undermined by GGING. In the earliest days of castle construction, builders faced an enormous problem. Medieval foundations were rarely as stable as today's engineering would allow. Soil was unpredictable. Clay could swell, sand could shift, and heavy stone walls could tilt if water accumulated beneath them. Castles were built in strategic locations on hills, near rivers, or in lowlands, but every location had its challenges. Rain, runoff, and spring floods threatened to destabilize walls, and builders needed a fast solution. Enter the temporary trench. These trenches were simple, dug along the perimeter of the castle, lined where possible with stones or wood. They diverted water away from foundations and courtyards. The goal was purely functional. Prevent mud from undermining the castle's structure, keep interior spaces dry, and maintain accessibility for inhabitants and soldiers. No one initially considered that these trenches might someday serve a military purpose or become iconic features of medieval architecture. They were, in every sense, temporary and utilitarian. Yet, practicality often evolves into permanence. Once filled with water, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by rainfall, the trenches had an unexpected side effect. They created physical obstacles that were difficult to cross without effort or preparation. For visitors, attackers, or even livestock, these ditches added an extra layer of protection. Castle residents quickly realized that while the moat had not been designed to repel invaders, it performed that function surprisingly well. One evening, after a minor skirmish near a lowland castle, a lord reportedly remarked, "The ditch did more to protect us than our walls ever could." From there, the moat's function expanded. Builders began to enhance the ditches intentionally, shaping banks, lining them with stone, and even controlling the depth of water. The water itself became a strategic tool, wide enough to slow attackers, deep enough to prevent crossing without ladders or bridges, and continuous enough to channel movement toward defensible gates. What began as a drainage measure had transformed into a proto-defense system. Interestingly, the moat's accidental nature influenced castle design more broadly. Walls were adapted to incorporate water features. Bridges were constructed to allow controlled access, and the surrounding land was modified to maximize the moat's efficacy. Even when attackers were absent, the presence of water conveyed a sense of strength, creating psychological deterrence. The medieval imagination, heavily shaped by improvisations, embraced this happy accident as both practical and symbolic. The moat's evolution did not stop at mere defense. Its presence affected daily life inside and around the castle. Residents learned to navigate around it, to manage water flow, and to use it as a reservoir for fish, fire protection, or livestock. Some moats became ornamental, while others were stocked with fish for consumption or leisure. The accidental trench, originally designed to manage mud, now supported diet, recreation, and even economic activity. As moats became common, their symbolic value grew. They were no longer just drainage solutions or defensive obstacles. They became emblems of power, prestige, and control. A castle with a wide, deep moat projected authority, suggesting that its lord had both engineering skill and the resources to maintain such a feature. Visitors approached with caution and respect, understanding that the moat itself represented status as much as security. The social and economic ripple effects were significant. Builders, laborers, and local communities became involved in constructing and maintaining moats, dug by hand with spades and picks, often using prisoners or laborers conscripted for service. The process required planning, labor management, and ongoing maintenance. Water flow had to be managed, banks reinforced, and debris cleared. Temporary improvisation had transformed into an institutionalized, permanent structure that demanded attention, resources, and expertise. Moreover, the moat illustrates a pattern repeated throughout medieval life. Temporary solutions becoming enduring institutions. Just as town criers and bells started as provisional fixes and became permanent social mechanisms, so too did moats emerge from necessity, evolve with usage, and solidify through repeated reinforcement. The accidental nature of the solution did not prevent it from becoming a defining Characteristic of medieval fortification. The psychological impact of the moat cannot be understated. Invaders, unfamiliar with the local terrain, often misjudged the distance or depth of these accidental barriers. The water created hesitation, fear, and confusion, effectively multiplying the castle's defensive capabilities without additional labor or weapons. Even today, historians note that some moats, originally mere drainage ditches, played decisive roles in the survival of medieval castles during attacks. Moats also influenced surrounding settlements. Towns and villages often sprang up near castles, and the presence of a moat-shaped street layout, road construction, and trade paths. Bridges became critical points of access, controlled by gatekeepers or lords. The distribution of water affected mills, farmland, and sanitation systems. What had begun as a temporary fix now structured both physical and social landscapes. Interestingly, the medieval approach to the moat reflects a broader cultural mindset: adaptability, pragmatism, and improvisation. Solutions were rarely discarded once they worked. Temporary fixes persisted because they solved immediate problems efficiently. Over time, as their utility expanded or evolved, these solutions were enhanced, formalized, and a drainage ditch became a moat, a messenger became a crier, and a bell on a sheet became the basis of a personal and social soundscape. The moat's evolution also highlights human creativity and opportunism. Medieval engineers and lords recognized potential in what had not been designed for grandeur. They observed, adapted, and amplified effects that were initially coincidental. This mindset, valuing practical efficacy, immediate results, and observable benefits, permeated medieval society. Temporary measures were rarely discarded. They were repurposed, refined, and celebrated. By the time moats were established as permanent features, they had taken on layers of meaning, utility, defense, symbolism, status, and social influence. The very landscape was reshaped, integrating water, earth, and stone into a coherent system that protected, organized, and represented power. What began as an improvised trench now commanded respect, influenced architecture, and structured the surrounding environment. The story of the accidental moat is a reminder of the medieval tendency to preserve what worked, regardless of original intent. Temporary solutions, once effective, rarely disappeared. They were reinforced, improved, and eventually celebrated. The ditch that kept mud away had become a defining emblem of medieval fortification, illustrating how necessity, creativity, and adaptability converge to create enduring institutions. And yet, the moat was still, at its core, a product of improvisation. Its permanence was accidental, a byproduct of repeated observation and adaptation. It was neither designed as a grand defensive masterpiece, nor intended to symbolize authority from the outset. Its effectiveness, longevity, and cultural resonance were contingent on practical results first, aesthetics second. This accidental approach, mirrored across many aspects of medieval life, reflects a broader pattern. Temporary fixes often become permanent because they work, and society seldom discards what functions effectively. From mud to majesty, what began as a simple drainage ditch, meant only to protect the castle from sinking into mud, quickly evolved into something far grander. A moat. Once water filled the trench, castle builders, lords, and residents alike began to notice an unexpected benefit. The stagnant or flowing water, initially a byproduct of rainfall and soil management, became an obstacle to anyone attempting to approach the castle uninvited. What had started as a utilitarian fix now had the potential to redefine defense entirely. Astonishment must have rippled through the castle's planners. They saw that what was once merely a trench now served as a protective barrier, discouraging trespassers, bandits, or rival lords from casually crossing into the castle grounds. A simple observation led to a decisive decision. Let's keep the puddle. That seemingly offhand remark signaled the birth of one of the most iconic features of medieval architecture. Mud and drainage had given way to majesty and security. The transformation was gradual, yet deliberate. Builders began reinforcing the banks of the water-filled ditch, widening it, and sometimes deepening it to make crossing more challenging. Stone retaining walls or wooden palisades were added to stabilize the edges. Water management became a critical task, ensuring that the moat stayed filled throughout the year, especially during dry spells. Streams, diverted rivers, or simple rain collection systems were employed to maintain a constant level, illustrating how an accidental feature became a carefully managed defensive resource. Interestingly, the moat's aesthetic appeal also emerged during this process. Reflecting the castle walls and surrounding landscape, it created a visual impression of power and grandeur. The water added symmetry, beauty, and an imposing presence to the fortress, transforming it from a functional residence into a symbol of authority. What was once mud and practical engineering had become a stage 4 display, a marker of prestige and an instrument of intimidation. The moat also had social and political consequences. Lords and their residents quickly realized that a water barrier could influence the behavior of visitors. Merchants, ambassadors, and even neighbors approached more cautiously, aware that entry required effort and permission. Access became regulated by drawbridges or gates, and the moat itself became a tool for control. The simple accumulation of water, once an afterthought, had now become an instrument of power. From a defensive perspective, the moat's accidental effectiveness was transformative. Attackers who might have bypassed walls suddenly faced an unexpected challenge. The water made it difficult to bring siege equipment close to the walls. CATED tunneling efforts and slowed troop movement. Temporary ditches, never designed with these intentions, now fulfilled critical military functions. In some cases, castles survived sieges primarily due to the presence of moats that had begun as mundane drainage solutions. The moat's multifunctionality did not end there. Beyond defense and aesthetics, it became a resource for food and leisure. Fish could be introduced, creating a supplemental source of protein for the castle's residents. Water could be used for irrigation, livestock, or fire suppression. In many ways, the moat became a self-contained ecosystem, supporting the castle's economy and daily life. The accidental puddle had transformed into a central feature of domestic and civic management. Over time, moats influenced the very layout of castles, and their drawbridges and gates were positioned to maximize defensive and practical benefits. Roads, pathways, and courtyards were planned in relation to the moat, altering the flow of movement and activity. Adjacent land was adapted to maintain water supply and manage overflow. The moat, initially a minor feature, became the organizing principle of both architecture and landscape. Culturally, the moat contributed to the aura of the castle as a center of authority. It symbolized not only security, but also sophistication and ingenuity. Visitors who approached a castle with a wide, filled moat recognized both the resources and intelligence required to maintain it. The moat became a public demonstration of capability, practical, aesthetic, and political. Muddy beginnings had evolved into a statement of majesty and control. The moat also affected military strategy beyond the castle walls. Surrounding villages, outposts, and fields had to consider the presence of water in planning movement, trade, and agriculture. Bridges became critical infrastructure points, monitored for security and taxation. The moat, an accidental invention, now had ripple effects on regional planning and logistics. It dictated human and animal movement, influencing entire networks of medieval life. Interestingly, the moat illustrates a consistent pattern in medieval problem-solving. Temporary fixes endure when they work, expand when they prove useful, and gain layers of significance over time. Builders initially created the ditch to manage mud, but its usefulness in defense, aesthetics, and social control ensured its permanence. What was accidental became essential. What was temporary became iconic. The process of intentional refinement highlights human ingenuity. Medieval engineers experimented with width, depth, and water flow. Some moats were filled with stagnant water, while others were fed by streams or aqueducts. Additional features like islands, stakes, or vegetation enhanced the protective quality. Even in peacetime, the moat served to delineate property, impress guests, and reinforce hierarchy. The castle's identity became inseparable from its water barrier. Over generations, moats developed a standardized presence across Europe. While early versions had been purely functional and localized, the accumulated knowledge of their effectiveness spread. Architects copied, adapted, and enhanced the design. What had begun as a local improvisation became a pan-European architectural feature. Moats transformed the silhouette of medieval castles, defining their iconic appearance for centuries. The moat's cultural symbolism also extended to literature and art. Chroniclers, painters, and storytellers highlighted the water-filled defenses as symbols of power, mystery, and inaccessibility. The once mundane trench became part of the medieval imagination. Tales of sieges, heroism, and negotiation all incorporated moats as critical elements, reinforcing the perception of castles as fortified, prestigious, and controlled spaces. Finally, the story of the moat from mud to majesty underscores the medieval tendency to transform practical solutions into enduring institutions. Accidental innovation became formalized through repeated observation, adaptation, and enhancement. Builders recognized utility, enhanced its effectiveness, and over time created an iconic feature. The moat's origins were humble, yet its impact on defense, aesthetics, society, and culture was monumental. Temporary taxes. Medieval kings were masters of improvisation, but not just with battles and diplomacy. They were equally adept at fiscal creativity, particularly when it came to the art of taxation. The one-time tax was their specialty, a fee levied with the explanation that it was temporary, necessary to fund a specific project, or critical for the kingdom's survival. It could be justified as a measure to build a bridge over a treacherous river, fund the purchase of swords for an urgent campaign, or repair city walls after an unexpected assault. What was meant to be short-lived often outlasted the crises that created it, leaving a permanent mark on the kingdom and its subjects. The logic was simple and persuasive. A king faced with war, famine, or natural disaster needed immediate funds. Yet, nobles, townspeople, and peasants were resistant to permanent financial burdens. A temporary levy, framed as a necessary and limited obligation, was more palatable. It appealed to civic duty, fear of punishment, and, occasionally, genuine loyalty to the crown. In practice, However, the temporary nature of the tax was often ignored once the money began to flow. The bureaucracy of collection, oversight, and enforcement ensured that the tax became semi-permanent almost immediately. Consider the case of a bridge construction tax. A river ran through a growing town, its banks unstable and dangerous, making travel and trade perilous. The king decreed a temporary fee to fund the building of a sturdy bridge. Townspeople grumbled but complied, understanding the immediate benefits. The bridge was constructed, praised by merchants and travelers alike. Yet, the tax lingered. Officials rationalized its continuation as maintenance or as necessary to repay debts incurred during construction. Before long, what was framed as a short-term levy had become an enduring component of local economic life. The wartime tax followed a similar trajectory. When armies needed swords, armor, and supplies, kings called upon their subjects to contribute. Nobles often provided manpower or resources. Peasants offered coins, grain, or livestock. The emergency was immediate, the need undeniable. But as the war ended, the infrastructure of collection remained. Auditors, tax collectors, and local stewards had established routines, and the revenue stream was too convenient to dismantle. What began as a temporary fiscal measure gradually solidified into a standard expectation of royal income. Temporary taxes were also surprisingly inventive. Kings tailored levies to specific circumstances, exploiting the social and economic habits of their subjects. A market tax might be imposed only during a festival or seasonal trade fair. A levy on wine or ale could be justified as funding for city defenses. Even the appearance of randomness had method. Taxing something that people relied upon ensured compliance and minimized overt resistance. In this way, kings turned everyday life into a mechanism for funding the crown, all under the guise of temporary necessity. This system of provisional levies required coordination across multiple layers of medieval administration. Royal envoys would notify town councils, sheriffs would oversee collection, and scribes recorded contributions meticulously. Receipts, fines, and penalties ensured compliance. Once established, the machinery for temporary taxation was remarkably durable. Even after the crisis had passed, dismantling it was inconvenient and potentially disruptive to royal authority. The temporary became permanent almost by default. Furthermore, temporary taxes left cultural footprints. People remembered the reasons they were imposed, sometimes exaggerated or distorted. Through oral traditions, stories informed communal understanding of authority and obligation. A levy that began as a wartime necessity could later be invoked as precedent for new taxes, giving the crown greater latitude in future fiscal decisions. The idea of temporary became elastic, defined as much by tradition and habit as by actual duration. Interestingly, this system also encouraged compliance through psychological framing. By presenting a tax as temporary and justified, kings leveraged a form of cognitive leniency. People were more willing to accept short-term pain for perceived long-term benefits. They tolerated the initial imposition, often forgetting the cumulative impact as the levy persisted. This principle of incremental acceptance would echo throughout history, a medieval precursor to modern fiscal psychology. The permanence of temporary taxes also shaped medieval economies in subtle ways. Merchants, aware of the recurring charges, adjusted prices, production, and trade routes. Local artisans factored levies into their accounting, and peasants adapted labor schedules to meet obligations. Even small, seemingly inconsequential levies had cascading effects on productivity, consumption, and wealth distribution. temporary financial measures became structural features of economic life. Interestingly, the kings themselves benefited beyond the revenue. Temporary taxes enhanced perception of responsiveness and decisiveness. By framing levies as solutions to pressing crises, rulers projected authority and competence. Subjects might grumble, but they also recognized the immediacy and necessity of the measure. Political legitimacy was reinforced, even as fiscal habits were entrenched. The temporary label served both practical and symbolic functions, cementing power while raising funds. Some temporary taxes even evolved into complex institutions. Royal accountants developed standardized systems to track collection, allocation, and enforcement. Local courts adjudicated disputes over payment. Officials were empowered to audit, seize, or punish non-compliance. Once established, these systems often outlasted the original justification for the tax, creating enduring bureaucracies and administrative norms. What was temporary in name became permanent in structure. Historical records reveal amusing examples of this pattern. In one notable instance, a tax levied to repair a castle wall continued for decades, long after the wall had crumbled. In another, a levy intended to fund a single military expedition persisted through multiple reigns, with each new monarch rationalizing its continuation. Subjects often complied out of habit, fear, or resignation, accepting the permanence of what had been framed as fleeting. The flexibility of temporary taxes also allowed kings to experiment. Different levies could be tested for efficacy, compliance, and successful measures were maintained, expanded, or adapted for new contexts. Failed or unpopular taxes could be quietly discontinued, giving the impression of responsiveness while reinforcing trust in royal judgment. This experimental approach further blurred the line between temporary and permanent, illustrating medieval pragmatism in governance. Over generations, these practices shaped societal expectations of fiscal obligation. People grew accustomed to periodic levies, anticipating temporary taxes during wars, infrastructure projects, or civic emergencies. The habit of compliance became ingrained, a cultural norm extending beyond individual reigns. The medieval notion of taxation temporary, flexible, yet enduring left a legacy that influenced later systems of governance and public finance. In conclusion, medieval kings' mastery of temporary taxation exemplifies a broader pattern in medieval society. Improvisation, persistence, and the accidental permanence of measures designed to be ephemeral. Levies intended to address immediate needs often outlasted their original purpose, creating lasting structures of finance, administration, and social expectation. What was temporary, when effective and enforced, almost invariably became permanent, shaping economies, governance, and daily life for generations. The tax that never left, wars ended, castles crumbled, bridges washed away in floods or rotted from neglect. Yet, one thing remained unshakable. The tax. Medieval societies quickly learned that temporary levies had a peculiar ability to outlive their purpose. A king's short-term financial fix often became a permanent feature of governance, embedding itself into the economic and social DNA of the realm. What started as an emergency measure to fund a bridge, a campaign, or a palace repair often lingered for decades, even centuries, outlasting both the crises and the people who had initially sanctioned it. Consider a kingdom where a bridge was urgently needed over a swollen river. The monarch decreed a temporary toll on market goods, ostensibly to pay for construction. Merchants complied, townsfolk grumbled, and the bridge was erected with speed and precision. Yet, as time passed, the river shifted, the bridge fell into disrepair, and the immediate need for funds disappeared. Despite the absence of necessity, tax collectors continued their rounds. New officials, unaware of the original reason, rationalized its continuation as civic maintenance or repayment of debts. Over generations, the levy became normalized, its origins forgotten, but its presence unquestioned. The persistence of temporary taxes was reinforced by administrative structures. Once a tax had a system of collection, records, and enforcement, dismantling it required effort, coordination, and political will. For a medieval king or local lord, it was far easier to let the tax continue than to disrupt an established revenue stream. The machinery of bureaucracy, once set in motion, had its own momentum. Clerks, auditors, and officials relied on the revenue for salaries and operations, creating incentives for continuity. Temporary taxes, in this sense, became self-sustaining. The cultural acceptance of lingering taxes was also notable. Subjects learned to live with these levies, incorporating them into the rhythm of daily life. Farmers calculated their yields and payments accordingly. Merchants adjusted prices and inventory to account for recurring fees. Even when the original justification vanished, compliance became habitual. Paying the tax was simply part of life, like attending church on Sundays or observing market regulations. In this way, temporary taxes shaped both behavior and expectation, embedding themselves deeply into social norms. Some temporary taxes evolved into entirely new fiscal institutions. What began as a levy for a single bridge might eventually fund local infrastructure more broadly. A wartime tax could morph into a standard military assessment. Towns developed treasuries, registers, and bureaucratic systems to manage these collections efficiently. Over time, these structures became formalized, creating enduring institutions that influence governance for generations. Medieval financial pragmatism turned expediency into permanence. The consequences extended beyond the local level. Kings and nobles recognized the utility of sustained revenue streams. Temporary taxes were gradually codified into law, referenced in charters, and recorded in legal documents. Courts adjudicated disputes over payments, and enforcement mechanisms grew more sophisticated. What had begun as an ad hoc financial measure now shaped legal and political frameworks. In many cases, these medieval systems form the backbone of modern taxation, influencing how governments think about levies, obligations, and revenue collection even today. The psychological dimension of enduring taxes was equally significant. Framing a levy as temporary made initial compliance easier, but its persistence was psychologically subtle. People rarely questioned a system that had always been in place, especially when enforcement was consistent and the payment routine predictable. Successive generations paid without fully understanding the origin. Yet, the rationale, however, long forgotten, continued to justify the tax. This created a layered perception of legitimacy, with a line between temporary and permanent blurred entirely. Interestingly, temporary taxes often intersected with social hierarchy and status. Nobles might petition to exempt themselves or reduce their payments, while commoners bore the bulk of the burden. Over time, these patterns reinforced societal structures, concentrating both fiscal responsibility and privilege. The unintended consequence of a short-term tax could thus ripple through centuries, shaping economic inequality and the distribution of power. Temporary taxes also influenced commerce in profound ways. Merchants had to anticipate recurring fees, altering trade patterns, pricing strategies, and supply chains. Towns with enduring levies saw slower migration of new traders, but increased stability in local markets. Wealthy patrons and guilds often lobbied for or against taxes depending on their economic interest, creating a complex interplay between temporary measures and long-term market behavior. What began as a stopgap measure gradually became a defining feature of urban economic life. Wartime taxes are particularly illustrative. Kings in need of immediate funds would levy charges on food, wine, livestock, or trade goods. The campaign would end, armies disbanded, and sometimes the bridges and fortifications they funded would crumble or fall into disuse. Yet the levy, now embedded in the administrative framework, persisted. Auditors maintained records, sheriffs collected dues, and townspeople paid dutifully. The persistence of the tax was a practical convenience, a financial anchor for rulers, and a historical accident that became normalized over generations. The permanence of temporary taxes also demonstrates medieval pragmatism. Kings and officials were less concerned with whether a levy had an original justification than whether it worked. If a tax effectively raised revenue, maintained infrastructure, or reinforced authority, it became entrenched. Practical success outweighed theoretical intent, highlighting a characteristic pattern in medieval governance. Improvisation often solidified into institution. Over decades, temporary taxes shaped not only finances, but social expectation. Subjects anticipated contributions during emergencies, incorporating them into annual budgets and life planning. Civic and religious calendars often intertwined with fiscal obligations, reinforcing the perception of inevitability. The temporary became habitual, normalized, and culturally embedded. Generations grew up with levies as unquestioned components of daily life, unaware of the crisis that had originally prompted them. Moreover, these taxes often left architectural and infrastructural legacies. Roads, bridges, and fortifications funded by short-term levies were maintained, extended, or replaced using continued collection. Entire civic systems, market oversight, road repair crews, and local treasuries depended on what had begun as a transient measure. Financial improvisation became institutional infrastructure, shaping the physical and administrative landscape of medieval kingdoms. Legal codification further ensured permanence. Temporary taxes, once recorded in charters or royal decrees, became reference points for new rulings. Courts cited old levies as precedent, reinforcing authority and ensuring continuity. What was intended to be fleeting persisted because it had entered the legal record, creating a framework for governance and taxation that endured long after its original context faded from memory. Ultimately, the story of the tax that never left underscores a recurring theme in medieval life. Temporary measures often endure when they function effectively. The urgency that prompts a levy may vanish, but the administrative, cultural, and legal machinery ensures survival. Medieval kings, perhaps unwittingly, created fiscal traditions that would shape economic life for centuries, leaving modern societies with enduring echoes of their short-term crises. The war would end. The bridge might crumble, but the tax remained a testament to human efficiency, inertia, and the enduring power of what was intended to be temporary. Market laws. In medieval towns, the marketplace was a center of life. Gossip, politics, and even entertainment converged in a single bustling square. Yet, behind the apparent chaos, there existed a web of rules, many of which were created hastily, sometimes for a single weekend, and often for reasons so arbitrary they seem absurd to modern eyes. Take, for instance, the seemingly trivial ban on selling fish on Sundays. On the surface, it may have appeared as a pious observance or an economic regulation, but in many cases, it was the result of a local bishop's personal wema headache, a displeasure with the smell of fish, or a sudden notion to assert spiritual authority over mundane trade. The medieval mindset treated law as flexible, contingent, and frequently improvisational. Market rules were meant to resolve immediate conflicts, prevent short-term problems, or appease influential figures. If a dispute arose over the quality of grain, a temporary regulation might be imposed to standardize measures. If a local authority found a practice offensive like selling fish too close to a church, he could decree a ban. These regulations were practical, often created without consideration for long-term impact. Yet, just as with temporary taxes or accidental moats, what began as provisional frequently became permanent. A one-weekend ban on fish sales might continue for years, decades, or even centuries. Merchants adapted. Legal codices recorded the regulation, and successors enforced it without questioning its origin. The ephemeral intention was cemented into tradition, leaving behind rules whose rationale was long forgotten, but whose effects endured. Market laws were also shaped by the complex intersection of commerce and religion. Bishops and clergy wielded significant influence, often dictating practices that seemed arbitrary but carried social weight. If a bishop declared that fish could not be sold on Sundays, townspeople complied, not merely out of piety, but to avoid fines, excommunication, or social disgrace. Even if the original reason, a headache or an aversion to odor, was trivial, the law acquired authority through enforcement and cultural acceptance. The imposition of such laws had practical consequences. Merchants had to adjust schedules, storage, and supply chains to comply with the new regulations. Fishmongers, for example, might fish in advance, preserving stock for permissible days or finding creative ways to sell products discreetly. Bakers, cloth sellers, and other vendors observed overlapping restrictions, shaping the rhythm of market activity. These temporary fixes, when enforced, dictated patterns of production, consumption, and social interaction. Arbitrariness was a hallmark of medieval market regulations. Rules were rarely standardized across towns or regions. What was forbidden in one marketplace might be acceptable in another just a few miles away. Local authorities exercised discretion, sometimes basing decisions on personal preferences or immediate practical concerns. A lord might ban horse trading near the castle on market day to prevent noise, while another town permitted it. The result was a patchwork of regulations, each justified by a short-term need, but capable of persisting long after the crisis had passed. Interestingly, these market laws reveal the medieval tendency to codify the temporary rules that were enacted to solve minor disputes or appease influential individuals often became institutionalized. Local courts enforced compliance, recording fines and penalties meticulously. Merchants and townsfolk adapted to these rules, integrating them into everyday business practices. Over time, the regulations became invisible to those living. Under them, they were part of the fabric of economic life, rarely questioned and accepted as permanent fixtures. Some market laws had surprising social consequences. Restrictions on trade could shift power dynamics between merchants, guilds, and authorities. Certain individuals or families benefited by being better prepared or more resourceful, while others struggled to comply. Patterns of economic inequality were reinforced, not through deliberate design, but through the inertia of provisional regulation. A seemingly minor ban on Sunday, fish sales could ripple outward, shaping livelihoods, social networks, and local economies. The creation and enforcement of these laws also illustrate the improvisational nature of medieval governance. Authorities rarely consulted extensive records, statistical data, or legal precedent. Instead, decisions were made quickly, often reacting to immediate problems or the demands of powerful figures. A temporary solution to a conflict between fishmongers and clergy could result in a law that endured for decades. Administrative convenience, social pressure, and habit ensured that the regulation persisted, outlasting the initial reason for its enactment. Cultural attitudes reinforced the permanence of temporary market laws. Medieval townspeople placed high value on tradition, continuity, and respect for authority. Once a law was issued, compliance became a moral and social obligation. The original rationale, perhaps a bishop's annoyance, a festival schedule, or a weather-related concern, faded from memory. What remained was the law itself, a self-sustaining rule that shaped daily life, social norms, and economic behavior. Over time, market laws also adapted to new circumstances, often compounding their original effects. A temporary restriction might be extended to additional goods, times, or locations. Enforcement mechanisms improved, with designated officials patrolling marketplaces, issuing fines, and resolving disputes. What began as a minor adjustment to a weekend market evolved into a structured system of regulation, influencing trade patterns and social behavior for generations. Legal codification further reinforced the endurance of temporary laws. Records, charters, and guild statutes documented regulations, making them part of the formal legal framework. Future authorities, faced with recorded precedents, rarely questioned their validity or origin. A rule established for a single weekend became enshrined in law, a permanent element of municipal governance and commercial practice. Market laws also interacted with other aspects of medieval society. Taxes, guild regulations, and trade agreements were intertwined with temporary rules, creating a complex web of obligations. Merchants had to navigate overlapping layers of authority, adapting to both local whim and long-standing custom. Compliance required knowledge, experience, and sometimes ingenuity, further embedding provisional rules into social and economic routines. Despite their arbitrary origins, market laws often promoted stability and predictability. Even rules enacted for trivial reasons could create a regulated environment, reducing conflict and uncertainty. Sellers and buyers learned to anticipate restrictions, adjust timing, and plan accordingly. Over generations, these provisional measures became part of the operational rhythm of medieval marketplaces, reinforcing both social cohesion and economic order. Interestingly, market laws highlight a pattern repeated throughout medieval society. Temporary fixes once implemented rarely disappear. Whether it is a ban on fish sales, a one-time tax, or a drainage ditch that becomes a moat, provisional measures tend to persist. Their effectiveness, combined with administrative convenience and social inertia, transforms short-term solutions into enduring institutions. The story of temporary market laws underscores the interplay between improvisation, authority, and habit. A minor regulation enacted to solve an immediate problem or address a personal annoyance could shape behavior, economics, and culture for generations. The medieval marketplace, with its patchwork of rules, demonstrates how temporary fixes often evolve into permanent fixtures, influencing social norms and institutional structures long after their initial justification has faded. In essence, the medieval marketplace was a living testament to human adaptability and the unintended longevity of temporary measures. Laws created for a single weekend for the convenience of a bishop or the resolution of a minor dispute, became woven into the fabric of daily life. Merchants, townspeople, and authorities alike adapted, complied, and institutionalized these rules, turning provisional fixes into enduring legacies that shaped medieval society in profound and lasting ways. Centuries of red tape. Fast forward 500 years, and one would be surprised to see townspeople still adhering to rules whose origin had long vanished into the mists of time. A market law prohibiting the sale of certain goods on specific days, perhaps enacted because a local bishop had a headache, or a festival required order remained in effect. Nobody remembered the original decree, the context, or even the rationale behind it. The bishop, long turned to dust, could not care less, yet the rule persisted. This is the enduring legacy of what we might call centuries of red tape, a hallmark of medieval societal structures that persisted far longer than anyone initially intended. The remarkable thing about these enduring rules is that they often outlived the very people who had created or enforced them. Legal codices, municipal records, and guild charters meticulously documented these regulations, preserving them across generations. Clerks copied texts, scribes inscribed them in heavy tomes, and bureaucrats enforced them faithfully. Even when local leaders changed or political regimes shifted, the law remained, now severed from its original context and motivation. It became a self-perpetuating system. Imagine a medieval marketplace in the 16th century, bustling with vendors, buyers, and wandering travelers. At first glance, life seemed governed by commerce and instinct. Yet, under the surface lay layers of rules and regulations, each one a relic of centuries past. Certain days were designated off-limits for specific trades. Weights and measures were strictly enforced, and certain products could only be sold at precise locations. To the modern observer, these regulations might seem arbitrary or oppressive, but they were the invisible scaffolding that held medieval society together. The endurance of these rules illustrates a fundamental principle. Once a temporary measure is codified into a bureaucratic or legal system, it gains momentum of its own. Officials become accustomed to enforcing it, merchants to complying, and citizens to adapting. The original purpose, whether it was a bishop's annoyance, a market conflict, or a wartime necessities, often forgotten. But the enforcement machinery continues to function. This inertia creates a remarkable continuity across centuries, connecting the medieval past with distant future generations. One of the reasons these rules persisted is that they became embedded in habit and expectation. Merchants learned that selling fish on a certain day was forbidden, and they adjusted their schedules, storage, and inventory accordingly. Children grew up observing these rules, internalizing them as normal. Over time, the regulation transcended its origin, shaping behavior, routines, and social norms. The marketplace, while dynamic and chaotic on the surface, was quietly structured by rules that no one actively questioned. Moreover, the complexity of medieval bureaucracy reinforced this persistence. Municipal councils, town sheriffs, guild leaders, and clerks all depended on consistency. If a rule had been enforced for years, it was administratively simpler to continue than to repeal it. Changing the law required consensus, discussion, and potential disruption, a daunting prospect in a world where authority was fragmented and communication slow. Temporary measures, once recorded, became difficult to reverse. Interestingly, the endurance of these rules had unintended consequences. Some regulations, like prohibitions on selling certain goods on particular days, created economic ripple effects. Merchants adjusted pricing to account for limited selling windows. Storage methods evolved to preserve goods until permissible days. Alternative trades or black markets sometimes emerged, reflecting human ingenuity in navigating rigid structures. In this way, red tape not only persisted but actively shaped commerce and social adaptation. The persistence of centuries-old rules also highlights the medieval approach to authority and tradition. Medieval society valued continuity, precedent, and the appearance of order. Once a rule had been enacted, especially with official documentation or ecclesiastical approval, it was treated as inherently legitimate. The reasoning behind it became less relevant than its formal status. People obeyed laws not because they recalled the original logic, but because obedience was expected, enforced, and socially reinforced. Cultural memory, too, played a role. Oral traditions, town histories, and communal storytelling preserved awareness of regulations, even as the original purpose faded. Market disputes, guild disagreements, and legal challenges all referenced these rules, ensuring that they were maintained in practice. The record of enforcement, the fear of penalties, and the desire to avoid social conflict ensured the survival of regulations long after their practical necessity had vanished. The endurance of red tape also demonstrates the cumulative nature of medieval governance. One temporary measure led to another, creating layers of rules, regulations, and ordinances that interacted in complex ways. Over time, this created a dense web of administrative requirements, each justified in its own context, but forming an intricate network that defined daily life. The rules became self-reinforcing. Compliance with one regulation often necessitated compliance with others. This compounded the permanence of temporary measures, as disrupting one part risked destabilizing the entire system. Furthermore, these persistent rules shaped not only commerce but social structure and behavior. Merchants who complied gained favor, reputation, and trust. Those who ignored regulations faced fines, exclusion from guilds, or social disapproval. Generations learned that abiding by these laws was a marker of respectability and civic duty. In this way, centuries-old red tape exerted influence far beyond its original trivial purpose, embedding itself into the moral and social fabric of society. Legal codification ensured longevity. Once a rule was inscribed in a municipal charter, recorded in a guild ledger, or referenced in court cases, it gained a formal status that was difficult to overturn. Successors unfamiliar with the original reasoning continued enforcement to preserve consistency and legitimacy. The bureaucratic machinery, once set in motion, carried forward the rule, creating a bridge between medieval improvisation and institutional permanence in some cases. These rules even influenced urban planning and infrastructure. Restrictions on certain trades or activities could dictate the arrangement of stalls, the flow of pedestrian traffic, and the allocation of space in marketplaces. Roads, squares, and bridges were designed to accommodate legal expectations, creating a physical manifestation of centuries-old regulations. The urban environment itself became a testament to the endurance of temporary decrees. Perhaps the most striking aspect of centuries of red tape is the sheer disconnect between cause and effect. Bishops long dead, market disputes resolved, emergencies forgotten, all were irrelevant to the continued enforcement of rules. Yet society persisted in observing them, demonstrating the power of institutionalization, habit, and social expectation. Temporary solutions became permanent not because they were necessarily needed, but because the machinery and culture of enforcement made them so. The story of these persistent regulations illustrates a broader medieval pattern. Improvisation, once codified and habitualized, hardens into tradition. A minor, short-term fix, whether to appease an authority figure, prevent a conflict, or manage a temporary crisis, often outlives its origin. Over centuries, these fixes shape behavior, governance, and culture, leaving traces of medieval pragmatism in the modern world. By the 16th or 17th century, townspeople obeyed rules without understanding their origin. The ban on selling fish on Sundays, originally a trivial concession to a bishop's mood, had become a norm, enforced by civic officials, expected by merchants, and observed by families. The medieval marketplace was as much defined by these enduring rules as by trade itself. Centuries of red tape, arising from ephemeral needs, had woven themselves into the very fabric of everyday life. The surnames we keep in the medieval world, names were rarely the permanent markers of identity that we take for granted today. Most people were known primarily by a single given name: John, William, Mary, or Alice. With limited literacy, small populations, and no standardized record keeping, there was often no need for more. But as towns grew, commerce expanded, and taxes became a fact of life, the necessity for clearer identification arose. Thus, surnames, family names, occupational labels, and locational identifiers were born. Ironically, many of these permanent markers were initially intended to be temporary, used for a single season, a single tax record, or even just a short-lived census. Take the example of John the baker. In a small village with 2 or 3 Johns, confusion was rampant, especially when taxes were assessed or when tradesmen conducted business. John the baker distinguished him from John the blacksmith or John the miller. For that year's tax season, the moniker sufficed. It clarified responsibilities, enabled accountability, and allowed bureaucrats to track contributions with minimal error. Once the tax season ended, the identifier was theoretically redundant, yet it rarely disappeared. Similarly, locational surnames emerged from practical necessity. Alice of York distinguished her from Alice of Lincoln. Such names were often employed only in official records, in court cases, or when her family traveled beyond their home village. The temporary labels solved immediate problems of identification in official, legal, and commercial contexts. They were functional, descriptive, and provisional by design, created to meet short-term administrative challenges. Occupational surnames were another prominent category. Blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, and millers became identified by their trade, which was crucial for taxation, guild registration, and economic transactions. Thomas the carpenter wasn't intended to become a hereditary marker. It was merely a tool for clarity. If Thomas changed occupation, moved towns, or died, the identifier was theoretically dispensable. Yet, in practice, these labels persisted, often solidifying into family names for generations to come. The durability of these temporary surnames had surprising consequences. Over time, John the baker passed his name to his children, who may never have baked bread. Alice of York had descendants living hundreds of miles from York, yet they carried the locational identifier as a legacy. What began as a temporary fix to a bureaucratic problem evolved into a lasting social institution, one that cemented family identity and lineage for centuries. Clerical played a central role in this transformation. Tax rolls, court records, and parish registers captured names with increasing consistency. Scribes and clerks, seeking to reduce confusion, repeated identifiers in official documents, reinforcing their permanence. even when the original function, such as a tax assessment, was no longer relevant. The written record ensured the continuation of the name. Over time, these provisional labels became institutionalized, resistant to erasure. Migration and urbanization further solidified as families moved to larger towns or neighboring regions. The identifier served as social shorthand, conveying occupation, origin, or lineage to strangers. John, the baker arriving in a new town, could be distinguished from other Johns by the occupational surname, and locals could easily reference family history, profession, or reputation. Temporary descriptors, once again, gained longevity by becoming functional in new contexts. Surnames also carried economic significance. Certain trades held prestige, rights, or guild memberships. Being identified as John the Smith or Alice the Weaver had immediate social and financial implications. Even if the original reason for the identifier was fleeting, the social and economic utility reinforced its persistence. The temporary became permanent not by decree but by necessity. It facilitated commerce, social interaction, and recognition. Another interesting aspect of medieval surnames was their adaptability. Variations emerged over time, reflecting local dialects, pronunciation, or clerical interpretation. Baker could become Baker or Baxter. Smith could be recorded as Smythe or Smith, while the spelling evolved. The underlying function remained. These were identifiers initially intended for clarity in temporary contexts, now codified through generations. Linguistic evolution, thus intertwined with administrative pragmatism, creating a rich tapestry of enduring family names. Surnames also reflected social hierarchy. Nobility and gentry often employed locational surnames to signify land ownership or territorial authority. Peasants and tradespeople used occupational or descriptive surnames. Regardless of origin, the names provided a sense of continuity and belonging, linking individuals to families, professions, or places. The temporary identifiers intended for bureaucratic clarity became markers of identity, social standing, and historical lineage. Interestingly, surnames were deeply intertwined with taxation and governance. Medieval officials relied on surnames to track obligations accurately. Repeated use of identifiers in tax rolls and census records reinforced the connection between name and responsibility. The practical need for temporary clarity thus created a mechanism that perpetuated surnames across generations, linking administrative necessity with cultural inheritance. Surnames could also preserve historical context. John the Archer hints at a family's historical role in military service. Alice the Tanner reflects an ancestral trait. While these identifiers were originally temporary, they preserved cultural memory, occupational history, and social function. Even centuries later, descendants carry these names, often unaware of the occupational or locational origins, yet still connected to a medieval world of necessity, improvisation, and practicality. The persistence of surnames underscores a broader medieval pattern. Temporary fixes often become permanent when they solve immediate problems effectively. Just as drainage ditches became moats, temporary taxes endured long after their initial purpose, and market rules persisted for centuries. Temporary identifiers became enduring markers of personal and family identity. What was designed to be ephemeral became institutionalized, embedded in both written records and cultural consciousness. Family names also became central to inheritance, legal identity, and property claims. By the later medieval period, surnames provided continuity for estate succession, legal contracts, and social alliances. A temporary identifier, initially unrelated to long-term legacy, became crucial in defining lineage, distributing inheritance, and establishing rights. The transformation of surnames from temporary descriptors to legal and social instruments illustrates the unintended permanence of pragmatic solutions in medieval society. Finally, surnames highlight the role of literacy and record-keeping in shaping social permanence. Clerks, monks, and administrators documented names meticulously in registers and rolls, ensuring that what was temporary in intent survived long after its original function expired. Administrative necessity, combined with cultural inertia and social utility, created a system where provisional identifiers evolved into enduring symbols of identity, lineage, and history. Thus, the seemingly simple John the Baker encapsulates a centuries-long story of necessity, adaptation, and unintended permanence. Temporary measures designed for bureaucratic clarity outlasted their immediate purpose, cementing themselves into the fabric of medieval society. What began as a fleeting solution to a practical problem became a foundation of identity, linking individuals to family, occupation, and community across generations. Frozen in time in the intricate tapestry of medieval record-keeping, a seemingly mundane labels to individuals for administrative purposes produced a legacy that stretches across centuries. Families were given identifiers based on occupation, location, personal traits, or familial association, not with the intention of permanence, but purely for practical convenience. Baker, smith, fletcher, or carpenter were not chosen to define lineage or destiny. They were temporary labels meant to organize a clerk's list for a tax season, a census, or a local record of trades. Yet, remarkably, these labels stuck. Generations later, families still carry names like Baker, even if ovens and bread-making have long vanished from their household. Consider the life of a medieval clerk working in a crowded town. The village had grown, and the local tax office struggled to distinguish among multiple Johns, Williams, and Marys. For administrative simplicity, the clerk added occupational descriptors: John the Baker, William the Smith, Alice the Tanner. These names were practical, temporary tools, a way to track contributions, payments, and obligations efficiently. They solved an immediate problem: confusion over identity and accountability. The clerk likely never imagined that the names would endure centuries into the future. Occupational were not unique in this enduring effect. Locational surnames, such as Alice of York or Thomas from Lancaster, arose similarly. They were employed to clarify residence, property ownership, or origin in official documents. Temporary markers in court cases, land grants, and tax records gradually became hereditary, passing from parent to child. Even when families relocated, changed occupations, or lost property, the surname endured, becoming a symbolic anchor in an ever-changing world. The phenomenon of frozen surnames highlights the unintentional power of medieval bureaucracy. Clerks and scribes were meticulous in their record-keeping, ensuring that the labels they created were consistently applied. Registers, charters, and tax lists were maintained for accuracy and reference. Over time, repetition, documentation, and social expectation embedded these temporary identifiers into societal consciousness. Families inherited names not because of intention, but because administrative convenience had codified them. Imagine a family centuries later, living in a modern city, entirely removed from the original occupation or location. They might be called baker despite no one in the household having baked bread in generations. The name persists, frozen in time, a relic of a medieval solution to a practical problem. The original purpose-clarifying identity for tax collection or census has long faded, yet the linguistic artifact endures, shaping identity, familial connection, and cultural heritage. This endurance reflects more than administrative happenstance. It speaks to the broader medieval approach to pragmatism and record keeping. Temporary solutions were rarely undone once implemented. Clerks had incentives to maintain continuity, ensuring that each entry could be referenced reliably in the future. Breaking this chain risked confusion, legal disputes, or challenges to authority. In this context, permanence emerged not from design, but from necessity. The persistence of surnames also reveals the interplay between literacy and social identity. In a largely illiterate society, written records were the ultimate authority. Oral tradition was flexible, adaptable, and prone to error. Official registers were fixed, authoritative, and enduring. A clerk's decision to label someone John the Baker carried weight beyond the immediate purpose. It was a record that other officials, future scribes, and successive generations would rely upon. The written word, even in its administrative mood, became a vessel for legacy. Moreover, surnames became central to legal and social structures. Property claims, inheritance rights, and contracts increasingly depended on clear identification. Temporary labels, once a tool for clarity, were absorbed into systems of governance, codifying family identity and ensuring continuity across generations. The Baker name, initially a clerical convenience, could determine legal standing, social expectation, and familial obligation hundreds of years later. Social mobility and economic change did little to erase these frozen-in-time labels. Even when descendants moved away from the trades that gave them their names, the surnames persisted as markers of heritage. A modern office worker named Smith or Carpenter may have no connection to metallurgy or woodworking, yet their name traces directly back to a medieval occupation. The disconnect between origin and present reality underscores the lasting influence of temporary administrative solutions. Surnames also carried symbolic and cultural weight. They became identifiers of lineage, familial pride, and community belonging. Even when detached from their original practical purpose, they provided continuity, linking generations across centuries. A family called Baker might celebrate ancestral pride, share stories of medieval forebears, or simply recognize a sense of identity tied to the name, oblivious to the fact that it was initially nothing more than a bureaucratic convenience. Interestingly, the endurance of surnames mirrors other medieval phenomena, where temporary solutions became permanent. Just as moats emerged from drainage ditches, temporary taxes persisted for generations, and market laws outlasted their original purpose. Temporary labels assigned by clerks hardened into lasting social constructs. Practical improvisation, when recorded and repeated, became institution. What was designed to be ephemeral acquired permanence through habit, documentation, and necessity. Clerical diligence played a central role in this process. The repeated recording of surnames in tax rolls, parish registers, and legal documents ensured consistency. Mistakes, once documented, were propagated and normalized. Over generations, the repetition of a surname in multiple official contexts entrenched it further, embedding it into the legal, social, and cultural framework of society. What began as a temporary fix became almost immutable. Surnames also influenced social perception. A family known for a trade or location was often associated with expertise, reputation, or authority in that area. Even if later generations abandoned the trade, the symbolic association remained. Baker implied a lineage tied to bread making, Smith to metalwork. Fletcher to archery. Names became shorthand for identity, skill, and heritage. Administrative necessity had inadvertently crafted social meaning. In addition, surnames provided continuity in community memory. Generations of townspeople, merchants, and officials recognized families by these labels. They functioned as anchors in a shifting society, linking new residents with long-standing families, maintaining social order, and simplifying interactions. Temporary identifiers had, through repetition and utility, become social glue, sustaining collective memory long after their original purpose had vanished. The phenomenon was not limited to occupational or locational surnames. Descriptive identifiers based on physical traits, temperament, or anecdotal events also persisted. Brown, short or strawn might have initially described a single individual's appearance or character. Yet these names were passed down, frozen into hereditary labels. The temporary, descriptive solution to distinguishing individuals, became an enduring element of personal and familial identity. Even the seemingly random nature of these labels became codified over time. Medieval clerks operated with a practical logic, assigning names based on immediate need, convenience, or oral testimony. Yet through repetition, documentation, and enforcement in civic, ecclesiastical, and legal contexts, these names persisted. Over centuries, what began as a clerical solution evolved into permanent markers of identity, linking individuals to a medieval past in ways both tangible and symbolic. Finally, the story of surnames frozen in time demonstrates the unexpected longevity of temporary solutions in medieval society. A simple administrative act to clerk, assigning baker to distinguish one John from another created a ripa effect lasting centuries. Families who have not baked bread in generations still carry the name, a linguistic relic of necessity, record keeping, and medieval pragmatism. What was designed as a fleeting organizational tool became an enduring feature of identity, history, and cultural continuity. The ghost of the past. Step into any modern town, and the traces of medieval improvisation are all around you, like invisible ghosts lingering in plain sight. The streets we walk on, the market systems we rely on, even the naming conventions we casually use, all carry echoes of a time when temporary fixes were the norm, and no one bothered to remove them once they had served their purpose. It is as if society itself were a house, patched together with short-term solutions, each layer of repair forgotten, yet remaining intact through centuries of habit, bureaucracy, and human inertia. Take infrastructure. For example, roads, bridges, and town layouts often trace patterns established in medieval times. Cobblestone streets, winding alleys, and market squares weren't always designed with aesthetics or long-term planning in mind. They were practical responses to immediate needs. Avoid a swamp, create a shortcut, prevent flooding. A narrow alley might have started as a temporary path around a construction site, a diversion meant to last a few months. Yet centuries later, it remains embedded in the city's DNA, dictating pedestrian flow and property boundaries. The same principle applies to legal and civic structures. Many contemporary regulations, ordinances, and property laws are the direct descendants of medieval stopgap measures. Temporary taxes, One-time fines or emergency proclamations created frameworks that survived far beyond their original intention. What began as a solution for a fleeting problem became codified, enshrined in statutes, and normalized over generations. Citizens may follow rules without understanding their origin, but their lives are nonetheless shaped by the echoes of medieval pragmatism. Even architectural features carry the imprint of temporary fixes. Consider the castle moat, now emblematic of medieval defense. Most did not start as grand designs. They began as drainage ditches, quick fixes to prevent castles from sinking into mud. Builders discovered, by accident, that the ditch filled with water and served an additional purpose, deterring unwanted guests. The improvised solution became a permanent feature, replicated across regions, and today we still marvel at the majesty of moats without realizing their accidental origin. Modern city parks, water channels, and urban drainage systems often echo this same principal: solutions to immediate problems, now permanent, shaping our environment centuries later. Even mundane objects bear the signature of medieval improvisation. Bells on livestock, keys, and boots were initially simple tracking devices. Over time, they evolved into fashion statements, symbols of status, and everyday tools, creating a persistent culture of auditory signals. Today, our fascination with notifications, alarms, and signals beeping smartphones, door chimes, wearable devices mirrors that medieval obsession. Temporary solutions to practical challenges once embraced become habits, norms, and ultimately expectations of daily life. Names and identities, too, carry the imprint of medieval temporary measures. Surnames, originally intended as fleeting descriptors for tax purposes, occupational clarification, or locational identification, have endured through centuries. Families who have never baked bread, practiced math, or lived in York still carry names like Baker, Smith, or York. These identifiers are linguistic ghosts, linking us directly to a medieval administrative system that sought clarity in a world of confusion. We live among these ghostly markers daily, often oblivious to their historical origin, yet their influence remains undeniable. Market systems offer another example. Regulations that began as short-term fixes, such as banning fish sales on certain days due to a bishop's whim, persisted for generations. Fast forward centuries, and townspeople continued to obey these rules long after the original rationale disappeared. Modern commerce still bears the imprint of these medieval adjustments. Scheduled market days, trade conventions, and even zoning regulations are rooted in centuries of improvisation made permanent through bureaucracy. Temporary fixes, once embedded in law and practice, shape economic behavior long beyond their intended lifespan. The persistence of medieval structures is also evident in taxation. What was meant to be a short-term levy to fund a bridge or military campaign often became a permanent fixture. The mechanisms developed to administer these taxes, record-keeping, collection offices, enforcement systems ensured their survival. Modern tax systems, inheritance laws, and civic funding strategies still reflect this heritage. The ghosts of medieval fiscal pragmatism haunt our ledgers, reminding us that temporary fixes, once effective, rarely disappear. Cultural and social habits, too, reveal the medieval foundation beneath the surface. Daily routines, communal observances, and civic expectations are built upon layers of historical improvisation. Festivals, work schedules, guild responsibilities, and market behaviors often evolve from temporary accommodations that became institutionalized. Even when the original reason is forgotten, the tradition persists, subtly guiding behavior and social interaction. Our lives remain entangled with decisions made centuries ago, for reasons that have long faded from memory. The psychological impact of these persistent solutions is profound. Humans have a tendency to accept continuity as normal, especially when it is reinforced by repeated observation, social expectation, and administrative enforcement. Temporary measures, once integrated into daily life, are rarely questioned. People assume permanence because disruption is inconvenient or unfamiliar. This inertia is why medieval improvisation continues to shape modern existence, quietly directing routines, norms, and societal expectations without conscious awareness. Urban design, too, is a canvas of forgotten medieval solutions. Streets that curve inexplicably, public squares oddly situated, and property boundaries that defy logic all reflect centuries-old improvisations. Medieval planners addressed immediate problems: drainage, defense, property disputes. Generations later, these decisions persist, constraining new construction, traffic flow, and public planning. Cities, in effect, are living museums of temporary fixes solidified into permanent features. Even in technology and infrastructure, echoes of medieval problem-solving persist. Water management systems, road networks, and communal storage solutions often evolve from short-term interventions. Early engineers or civic planners improvised to meet immediate needs, diverting floodwaters, stabilizing roads, or creating storage for grain. Over time, these solutions became permanent structures, replicated, expanded, and integrated into future planning. Modern urban landscapes are layered with these historical echoes, from ancient aqueducts to cobbled streets, reminding us that temporary fixes, when effective, endure. Education and literacy also bear traces of medieval pragmatism. Town criers, initially a temporary measure to disseminate urgent information, became a permanent fixture, forming early systems of mass communication. Bells, signals, and announcements structured daily life. These temporary interventions influenced social organization, knowledge dissemination, and communal interaction frameworks that evolved into contemporary communication systems, public announcements, and even modern notification culture. Administrative red tape, too, can be traced back to medieval improvisation. Rules, regulations, and procedures often emerged as short-term solutions to immediate problems. A dispute between merchants, a taxation inconsistency, or a clerical confusion. Over time, these solutions were documented, codified, and normalized. Centuries later, bureaucratic procedures continue to reflect this heritage, demonstrating the lasting power of temporary measures institutionalized through records and habit. Even societal hierarchy and governance reveal the imprint of medieval improvisation. Decisions made for short-term convenience, temporary titles, provisional tax exemptions, or emergency levies often became permanent fixtures. Nobility, merchants, and townspeople adapted to these measures, and the structures became self-reinforcing. Authority, legitimacy, and social order were maintained, illustrating how temporary measures can evolve into enduring pillars of governance. The linguistic landscape, too, reflects centuries of medieval pragmatism. Place names, occupational terms, and family surnames are frozen in time, carrying stories of administrative necessity and social organization. Modern residents use these names daily, often unaware of their origins, yet they subtly shape perception, identity, and local culture. We navigate a world defined by historical improvisation, where temporary labels became permanent markers of society and geography. Ultimately, the medieval world surrounds us, its ghostly presence embedded in our environment, our culture, and our institutions. The streets we walk, the names we carry, the laws we follow, the bells we hear, and even the taxes we pay all are echoes of temporary measures that were never undone. Each patch, each adjustment, each improvised solution from centuries ago has been preserved, intentionally or not, leaving us to inhabit a house built from the forgotten repairs of the past. The ghost of the past is not merely metaphorical. It is tangible, pervasive, and influential. Every modern convenience, every legal structure, every social norm has layers of medieval improvisation hidden within it. What was meant to be temporary continues to dictate the rhythm of life, shaping culture, infrastructure, governance, and identity. Our present is haunted by solutions designed for emergencies, crises, and short-term fixes, and the shadows of these interventions continue to define the world. Closing thought, as we navigate the modern world, it is fascinating again, slightly unnerving, to recognize how much of what we consider new or contemporary is actually rooted in medieval improvisation. Every notification pinging on your smartphone, every convenience fee tacked onto an online purchase, every little bureaucratic obstacle we face can trace a lineage back to the pragmatic, temporary solutions of long-forgotten medieval towns, markets, and courts. When a medieval peasant hastily dug a drainage ditch that would later become a moat, or when a town clerk temporarily called someone John the Baker to simplify tax collection, they could never have imagined the endurance of their improvisation. Yet here we are, living amidst the echoes of those decisions. Consider the modern notificana, simple buzz or ping that interrupts our day, demanding attention. It feels new, a product of the digital age, yet its medieval counterpart, the town crier, was doing the exact same thing centuries ago. The bell ringing in the town square, shouting urgent news to literate and illiterate alike, was a temporary fix for an immediate communication problem. Towns realized that people listened to a loud man with a bell and, unwilling to teach everyone to read, institutionalized this practice. The temporary solution became permanent, and the crier became a living notification system. In essence, every push notification we ignore or respond to is a modern echo of that medieval improvisation. Similarly, convenience fees are not a modern invention at all. Medieval kings frequently imposed temporary taxes to fund wars, build bridges, or repair infrastructure. The initial intention was short-term, a one-off request to cover immediate needs. But those taxes, like convenience fees today, often became embedded into the financial systems of towns and kingdoms. Citizens got used to paying extra, adapted their behavior, and the system solidified over time. The medieval peasant or townsman who grumbled under his breath at yet another levy would likely recognize our modern equivalents instantly. Some things, it seems, never truly go away. Even our social habits, our bureaucracy, and the way we organize society bear this imprint. Rules created for a weekend or a single market day persisted for centuries. Occupational labels designed for clarity in one tax season became permanent families. Buildings, moats, roads, and town layouts that were once improvisational solutions are still in use today, guiding traffic, property ownership, and civic planning. Our lives are built atop layers of medieval pragmatism, yet most of us are completely unaware of it. Every habit, every rule, every minor annoyance has its ghost in history, whispering reminders of how the past shapes the present. The permanence of these temporary measures is not simply a historical curiosity, it profoundly influences our expectations and our behavior. Consider how easily we accept certain inefficiencies, inconveniences, or arbitrary rules as part of modern life. Long queues, service fees, rigid schedules, and bureaucratic protocols all feel like inherent features of contemporary society. Yet they are often inherited, not invented anew. The medieval world, in its resourcefulness and improvisation, created systems that were never meant to last, but did. These ghosts of the past mold our perception of normality, guiding how we interact with authority, commerce, and technology. There is also a subtle humor in this continuity. The medieval peasant who once rolled his eyes at yet another short-term tax or temporary market regulation might be quietly amused to see that, centuries later, people are still paying extra for convenience, checking notifications compulsively, and following rules whose original rationale has long vanished. Our civilization, in many ways, is a monument to the endurance of temporary measures, and the irony is palpable. We labor under systems we assume are modern innovations, yet their essence is as old as the medieval improvisation that birthed them. Even more remarkable is how these medieval solutions have adapted to modern technology and culture. Bells became phones. Town criers became news outlets. Temporary taxes became subscription services and transaction fees. And surnames became digital identifiers, usernames, and account IDs. The underlying principle is the same. Humans create temporary fixes to solve immediate problems. And when effective, those fixes become permanent fixtures in the social and technological landscape. The medium changes, but the pattern remains. Urban planning, governance, commerce, and even communication systems demonstrate this continuity. Roads follow medieval paths. Market regulations echo ancient ordinances, and financial structures mirror the fiscal improvisations of long-dead monarchs. Even seemingly trivial aspects of life, how we track individuals, schedule activities, or enforce rules can be traced back to practical, short-term solutions that outlived their creators. It is as though history left a blueprint of improvisation that continues to dictate modern existence, layer by layer, century by century. The psychological impact of this persistence is equally profound. Humans are adaptive, but we rarely question the permanence of systems we inherit. Just as medieval townspeople followed rules they no longer understood, we adhere to digital, economic, and social norms with minimal reflection. Notifications, fees, and regulations shape our attention, spending, and behavior in subtle ways, much like the temporary fixes of the medieval past shaped theirs. Our awareness may be limited, but our actions remain tethered to centuries-old patterns of pragmatic problem-solving. Ultimately, the lesson is both sobering and delightful. Every day, we live in a world constructed from temporary measures that were never undone. Every buzz, every fee, every quirky regulation is a reminder of the enduring legacy of medieval improvisation. The systems we navigate, the structures we inhabit, and the routines we follow are, in essence, living fossils of short-term solutions that have achieved unexpected permanence. We inhabit a world designed by ancestors who never intended their fixes to last this long. Yet somehow, here they remain, shaping our lives in ways both obvious and subtle. So, next time you feel frustrated by a notification, annoyed by a convenience fee, or baffled by an obscure regulation, remember this: you are participating in a centuries-long dance with history. Somewhere, a medieval peasant, clerk, or town official is laughing quietly, recognizing the patterns that persist. They improvised, they patched, they solved immediate problems, and their work endures far beyond their imagination. Some things, it seems, never truly go away. The medieval world is all around us, entwined with our modern experience. From the surnames we carry to the systems we rely on, the echoes of temporary solutions resonate daily. These solutions, once practical and ephemeral, have hardened into cultural, social, and institutional permanence. Our civilization, for all its advancements and innovations, remains haunted by the ingenuity and pragmatism of medieval improvisation. We are living in a house built of temporary repairs, and those repairs continue to dictate the rhythms, rules, and structures of our lives. In reflecting on this, we recognize the profound interconnectedness of past and present. Medieval improvisation was not isolated. It was cumulative, layered, and transformative. Temporary fixes became permanent, shaping commerce, governance, culture, and personal identity. Today, as we interact with notifications, fees, rules, and social expectations, we are enacting the legacy of centuries-old solutions, unaware of the medieval roots of our modern behaviors. Every aspect of daily life carries echoes of improvisation, an enduring testament to the ingenuity, practicality, and persistence of our ancestors. Thus, the medieval world is not merely a period of history. It is a living, breathing presence in our lives. The temporary became permanent. The improvised became institutionalized, and the short-term solutions of the past continue to guide our experience of the present. Every notification ping, every convenience fee, and every inherited name is a reminder that human solutions, once effective, rarely disappear entirely. Somewhere, a medieval peasant is quietly observing, perhaps chuckling at the irony, as the world they helped shape continues its relentless march forward, proof that some things indeed never truly go away.